All right, I think I should be live now. My apologies to everyone who's waiting. Internet issues, I'm sorry about that. Of course, my internet picks today to act up, but I've been trying to resolve them. And in all honesty, we may well have problems as we go on with the stream, but never mind that. Today, we are powering through. But again, apologize to everyone who's been kept waiting. I think everything should be good, and we should at long last, be ready to go. Now then, I did not plan to upload anything this soon, but it appears that the last video I put up on the Ukrainian war has attracted some attention. This is, of course, a good thing. I presented a rather interesting and unusual take, and people found it worth looking at, worth responding to, worth thinking about. All that is to the good. And I've gotten two responses. It seems one from Charlemagne, who appears to have originally shared the video on his Substack, it then spread to some other people. And Semiogogue devoted part of his recent stream to responding to some of the things I say in that video. Now, throughout the stream, he will say repeatedly that he has not had time to watch the video in its entirety, and that's going to become important. That's gonna make a difference. That's gonna have an impact on what he says, because, well, to put it bluntly, if he had watched the whole video, he would know that that video was not intended to be my full statement on what I think is really going on in the war, and so it shouldn't be treated as such, and so you shouldn't respond to it as such. Now, not only did he more or less treat it that way, he didn't even watch the whole video. So he's taking a partial statement of a partial statement and responding to that, and there are obvious problems attendant to that. Now, okay, I'm not going to go through his entire stream, obviously, which is 3 hours long, and I don't want to sit here for an eternity for obvious reasons, especially given that my internet has not been great. So I'm gonna, as you see, I've already skipped ahead to a certain portion of it, and there are really two parts of the stream that I want to discuss. In the first, Semiogogue doesn't really respond to me. He's not really talking about me so much as responding to Charlemagne's Substack post about me and about my video. So I'm gonna pass over most of that because it's not germane to me, and I'm not really interested in it. And I have my own response to Charlemagne in any case. However, in this first portion of the stream that I'm going to play through, he does make two claims. Semiogogue does make two claims that are in sore and desperate need of a response. And they are, first, that Kiev was a feint, and secondly, that at least at this point in the war, if not earlier, Ukrainian personnel losses, at least, are likely to be higher than Russian personnel losses. So those are really the two claims I'm going to focus on. And after I take care of those, I'm going to skip a bit ahead into the stream to about the 2 hour, 10 minute mark, which is where he really starts talking about me fully. So yeah, with that, let us proceed. Let's get going with this. Here is Semiogogue. I'm going to let him speak for himself.
Where is that one? I just opened the damn thing. Let me do it again. There it is. CharlemagneSubstack.com. So now, first thing I should say, whether I agree with Charlie on this or not, on specific.
Oh, by the way, I put this at 175. Oh, two times speed, 2x. All right, I'm going to pull this down to 175. So if you're going to be watching this later, after it's already, if I'm no longer live, and you speed it up, this is probably going to be going very fast. I'm just doing this to save time. I hope it's not a problem for anybody.
That the guy he shared puts forth, I certainly support Charlemagne in terms of just wanting to go look everywhere and anywhere to try to get a take on this. And again, I recommend his Substack, as well as Apostolic Majesty for historical context, Charlemagne's channel in general, and the Prudentialist, good buddy Prudentialist, who is staying up on strategic happenings out there in the big wider world. Let me see if I, oh God, damn it, every time I gotta open this. There we go. Let me see if I can carry this over. Okay, now, yes, in theory, we'll be able to see this. So you guys can go and check this out to see what you think of it. I recommend you do. I should also say I have not yet had a chance to watch everything that this guy has put out there.
As I said, that's going to be important.
And what we're doing here, there's two things, as will become clear as we go forward. There's a guy called Ivan the Heathen, and I don't think that somebody with a proper dissident right persona being chosen as a mouthpiece for this, if indeed it's not just him spontaneously doing something, I don't think that's an accident. Nor do I think it's an accident. He talks about this. He uses terms like midwit and talks about the dissident right. I don't think it's an accident that that he's got letter text on the shirt that he's wearing. If indeed he is not someone who really is exactly what he says he is, then there are certain signs up here. But anyway.
Okay. Let's just be blunt here. He's insinuating that I'm CIA. Okay. Let's just get that out there right away. Let's open this sucker up. Now, I'm not going to respond to this immediately because in the second section that I mentioned going to starting at about 2:10, he goes into this again, and I'll get into that then. Although if you look at his chat window, you can see one commenter already. What is it? Freddled Grunt Bugley, who says coroner T-shirt. Yes, thank you. Someone knows what it is. But as I say, I'll respond to this thing later when he mentions it again after he goes through Charlemagne's article. It's really only the two claims that I mentioned that I want to respond to in this portion. I'm just playing through this stream now because I don't want to look like I'm putting words in the guy's mouth, and I want him to speak for himself. But anyway, yeah, so the insinuation is that I'm CIA. Oh, by the way, you're totally right. Just really quickly, you're totally right because all CIA guys have shitty internet, just like this. This is absolute proof. You're on to me. What can I say?
Anyway, Ivan the Heathen apparently sets forth his own views and then includes a clip that he went to considerable trouble to translate into English for everyone. If nothing else, Charlemagne, Ivan the Heathen guy, and the material, the original content that's posted is interesting because somebody went to the trouble to give you a good English translation of what's being discussed, and it's a different take on things. So basically, let me just read what Charlemagne says about this. You should go again, subscribe to his Substack and read it yourself. He mentions that there's new information on the war in Ukraine, puts it in a new light. It's Ivan the Heathen guy, as a Ukrainian native who speaks Ukrainian, Russian, and English. Charlemagne himself says you should watch the entire video. The basic summary is
Charlemagne is right. You should. Oh, by the way, looking at his chat again, I see Freddled Grunt Bugley again. And Corner a good band though. Yes, they are, and that's really all there is to the shirt. But anyway,
that when all this broke out in February, the Ukrainian government was basic summary of the position. This guy and the people he includes video segments from. The basic picture they set forth is that on February 24, 2022, the Ukrainian government was filled with fifth columnists who intended to surrender the country to Russia. This goes all the way up to President Zelensky himself, who was not, in fact, a Western stooge, but a Russian one. President Zelensky had issued orders to the Ukrainian military designed to allow the Russian army to simply march into the country and take it over without a fight. However, Ukrainian generals loyal to Ukraine and not its president disobeyed orders and arranged for a real defense of Ukraine. What proceeded to happen is that the Russian military marched into the country as planned, but began to face opposition that it not only did not expect, but was entirely unprepared for.
That's basically correct. I'd say that's a fairly accurate summary on Charlemagne's part. Yeah.
The military force that Mr. Putin sent to Russia was nothing more than a military parade that would accept the surrender of Ukraine and cede control over the country in whole or in part to Russia. Mr. Putin made a grave mistake of believing that President Zelensky stood for Ukraine, when in fact he himself was not the only one Putin was dealing with. Russia therefore found itself in a war that was not supposed to happen. Charlie said he likes this because Charlemagne says he likes this, Mr. Maine, because there are a bunch of odd things that have always irritated him about all of this that didn't make any sense, and this presumably provides some plausible explanation. One, an immense Russian death toll at the beginning of the war. I don't know what to say about that. I think plenty of Russians did die, but we don't have any figures. We've just got claims about an enormous Russian death toll, and at this point, I haven't seen anything to corroborate the idea that they suffered an immense death toll at the beginning. So I don't know that fact needs to be accounted for.
Okay. Let's see. Should I respond to the immense Russian death toll claim separately? Because it is tied in with the claim that Kiev was a feint. I'll play a little bit further. I'll let him keep going.
Charlemagne points out bizarre Russian paratrooper operations.
Okay. Actually, you know what? Yeah,
I don't know that they were really bizarre, because everything that could be described as a total debacle of trying to march towards Kiev and everything else and having it not work could just as easily be described as a feint.
Okay, there we go. All right, let me put this as kindly and charitably as I can. The claim that the Russian attack on Kiev was a feint is extremely unlikely to be true. Extremely. And if it was a feint, it may have been quite possibly the most idiotic feint in military history. And there are a number of indicators that lead us to this. Now, Anyone who is going to have a serious discussion about this war must, it seems to me, start in one place. And that place is the Oryx archive. There are 2 pages here. Oryx, for those of you who don't know, and it seems to me that many on the dissident right don't know, but this is an extremely important resource. It's one of the few pieces of objective information that we have that can allow us to see through the fog of this war and allow us, in at least a broad kind of macro way, to formulate a general picture of what's really happening. And furthermore, a picture that is not reliant on the welter and storm of claims and counterclaims that have been running back and forth constantly throughout this war. So what Oryx is it is an enormous archive of pictures and video that have been taken since the very beginning of the war, showcasing both Russian and Ukrainian equipment losses. This is the page showing all Russian equipment losses, and the page here deals with Ukrainian equipment losses. Now, as of today, October 3rd, you scroll down, you will see that there are in total 6,647 entries for Russian losses. This includes all kinds of losses from vehicles that are destroyed, damaged, abandoned, captured. And the same goes for Ukraine. The Ukrainian number is 1,672. You can see the breakdown here. Now, the point is this. How do we know that this archive is trustworthy? Well, first of all, there is enormous effort. There has been enormous effort put in trying to make sure that duplicates are not submitted to the archive. And this is done in various ways. For example, when you take a video or when you take a photograph of something with a phone, the file, that the video or the picture file has certain metadata associated with it. This includes things like timestamps. It may, in some cases, though certainly not in all, include geolocation data. And so if you have a video that was originally taken at one time and was, say, altered in various ways to look differently, or to make it seem as though it was taken at a different time or in a different place, there is metadata that you can examine that will allow you to rule out fakes and duplicates like this. And this is what the people who have compiled this archive have done. They have compiled every piece of evidence from across the internet for every destroyed Russian vehicle and every Ukrainian destroyed, damaged, captured, etc. Vehicle, and just built an archive. And this has given us an enormous trove of data, and we can analyze that data and come to some fairly objective general conclusions about what is really going on in this war. Now, why do I say that it is extremely unlikely that Kiev was a feint? Well, one need only to look at these losses. Now, by the way, these links that you see here, all this stuff, they're divided according to the type of vehicle, but then within each type, the pictures or the video are ordered chronologically. So the first T-72A tank here that was destroyed was the very first we have evidence of having been destroyed in the war. The second is the second, and so on in progressive chronological order like that. That's how the archive is organized, and the same for Ukraine. Now, if you want to claim that this archive, that this data source is illegitimate, if you want to claim that in some way it is biased against Russia, that it underreports Ukrainian losses, then you are the one who must give an argument for why this is so. And you are the one who must provide a better source of data, something more trustworthy than this, and then explain why that alternative is more trustworthy. In the absence of that, this is the best thing that we have to go on. This is the closest thing to objective information that we have, and we should make use of it to figure out what's going on. Now, in addition to these 2 pages, there is another extremely useful page put together by Ragnar Gudmundsson, I believe is his name, an Icelandic data scientist. And he has taken the data from both of these pages, crawled over it, and analyzed it in various ways to produce, various graphs, various trend lines, and to showcase various patterns in the data. This is enormously useful. For example, we can see various breakdowns that he has here. So we've got let's see. Let's go to the development of confirmed page. Come on, load up here. This is from July to September. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover the whole war. He's got limited things that he showcases, but as you can see, I mean, this kind of moves quite well. Hold on, there's a part here that I want to find specifically. I don't think it's here. Oh, here we go. Ratio visually confirmed to ratio of Russian equipment losses to Ukrainian equipment losses. Okay, so what this does here, the white line is the Ukrainian claims, the claims that have been given by the general staff. And then the green line is the ratio between what's found in the Oryx archive and that is the ratio between the claims and what's found in the Oryx archive. So when it says here 4.1, this means for every vehicle that vehicle that was found and proven by Oryx to have been, let's say, destroyed or damaged or captured, etc., every Russian vehicle for which it applies, there are four vehicles that the Ukrainian General Staff claims to have done this to. Now you can watch the development of this green trend line here, and you will notice that by the end of March, it spikes up quite high. It actually reaches the highest point that it has reached in the end of the war. It gets quite high here as well, though not quite as high here. Now, in the very earliest days of the war, you can say quite reasonably that there was a fog of war, that even if video had been taken in the very earliest moments, it probably wasn't uploaded until somewhat later. And it was only a few days or weeks after much of the action had occurred that we started to get an accumulation of the evidence. And that probably explains this somewhat later spike. Now, in the argument that I'm making here, I'm going to make an assumption. I regard it to be a reasonable assumption. If you do not regard it to be a reasonable assumption, the onus is on you to provide an argument for why that is so. The assumption is this. Equipment losses and personnel losses are non-negligibly correlated with one another. Now, what do I mean by non-negligible? Well, something significant. Not necessarily a correlation of 1, but, not necessarily like 0.1 or 0.2 or something small like that either. This is reasonable because, look, if you have vehicles, you're going to need a crew to operate the vehicles. And so if you see a column of vehicles that are destroyed and that only burned out husks of them remain, it's fair to assume that quite a few men were killed in that attack as well. So what you see here is this massive spike in vehicular losses, this massive spike in the ratio, which means Russians were taking very heavy losses relative to Ukrainians at this time, and then it levels off a bit. Okay, that's an indicator that Russian losses in the early days of the war were quite high, and that they settled down a bit later. So if you want to make the argument that the Russians took some serious losses in the early days, it really looks like they did. This confirms it. Now, there are some other things we can look at if you have doubts about the objective validity of this archive. Let's go to, here it is, development continued. Okay, now this splits it up into various types of vehicles, tanks, planes, infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, artillery. So this breaks it down by type. But the thing that I want to point to here is you've got the red line representing Russian losses, the yellow line representing Ukrainian losses, and then the two white lines represent the respective general trend lines for each. Now, I want to call your attention to the development of these movements over time. And each point on this graph represents, by the way, the daily losses for that day. So it's a development of daily losses. It's not an accumulation, it's not a total, it's how the day-to-day losses change for each side. What I want to call your attention to here is look at what happens around May and June. The two lines begin to converge. Same thing, May, June, parts of July as well, the lines begin to converge. Over here, an infantry fighting vehicle, May, June, July, they converge. Once again, over here, May, June, July, they converge. Why is that significant? That is significant because in May, June, and July, the Russian army was advancing. In late June, the Russians captured Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And then, if you look at a further portion of this graph, the portions of August and especially September, what do you see? You see the trends diverging yet again. Once again, divergence here, not so much here, but slightly so. Okay, so you see convergence during May, June, and July, divergence during September. Why is that significant? In May, June, and July, the Russians were advancing. If they were advancing, they were probably inflicting heavier losses than before on the Ukrainians. And so the Ukrainians were taking heavier losses relative to the Russians than they were before, which means that you would therefore expect those trend lines to converge. In September, when Ukrainian counterattacks began in Kherson, in Kharkiv, and now as they're moving into Donetsk and Luhansk, you would then expect the opposite to happen. You would expect the Russians to take higher vehicular losses relative to the Ukrainians. And so you would expect at that point for the trend lines to diverge, which they do. In other words, the general trend of this data is exactly what you would expect it to be if the archive was an objective and reliable source of information about the general pattern of this war, about how it's generally unfolding. So again, if you want to deny this, if you want to claim that there's some sort of systematic bias, you have to explain why these things happen to line up in precisely the way that you would expect them to line up if this were a viable and valid and effective source of data. So my basic argument then is that let's switch back to the ratio page. In the early days of the war, Russians took heavy losses relative to Ukraine, just as they are now, although the ratio isn't quite as high now as it was in those very early days. The Russians are taking heavy losses now because they're taking counterattacks, and in the early days they were taking even heavier losses. So does the general claim that the Russians took heavy losses in the early days of the war hold water? Yes, it does. Are those losses as high as the Ukrainians claimed them to be? Were they necessarily killing, 1,000 or so Russian soldiers every day for the first week or so? Probably not. But nevertheless, in general, there seems to be something to this, that the Russians took pretty high, pretty significant, perhaps even catastrophic losses in the early days. The archive confirms this. Now, on to the claim that Kiev was a feint. Why is this important? Well, think about what you would need to do if you were trying to organize a feint. What is the ideal that you would be striving for? Well, what you'd want to do, ideally, it seems rather obvious to me, is you would want to expose as few of your own men and as little of your own equipment, particularly your valuable equipment, to damage and destruction as possible, while at the same time diverting as many enemy troops from your true objective as possible. Now, is that what happened in the early days of the war? Well, look at these equipment losses. They were high. So the Russians were losing a lot of equipment in the midst of a feint. Really? I mean, that seems rather bizarre. At the very least, if this was a feint, it was an extremely poorly managed, organized, and executed feint. As a bit of further evidence to this effect, I would like to share with you one of my favorite videos from the entire war. This was posted on February 27th, which means it was taken a bit earlier. And this is a video of a street in Bucha. And you may have seen it because it's quite a famous video, but I love this video not only for the enormous amount of destroyed Russian equipment that it showcases, but also for the extremely colorful language that this old man uses while taking the video. So I'm just going to play this.
Діма, хлопці, от що осталось біля мого дому, блядь. Я в долгу не остався і не останусь, блядь. Оце їхні підарасам, блядь, сука, техніка вся. Вот, пожалуйста, блядь. Сука.
It's every other word is a curse. I can't even translate this into English. This is amazing.
Блядь. Пришли, блядь, сука, до нас, підари йобані, блядь. Щоб вам, сука, всім в аду горить, блядь. Підараси йобані, блядь. Сука, я своей жизни не пожалею, блядь, на этих пидоров, блядь. Сука. сука, гандоны. Это все возле моего дома, блядь.
Again, this is what happened to the Russians in the midst of an alleged feint.
Гандоны ебаные, блядь. Я в долгу не остался, блядь, ребята, не остался в долгу.
Again, it's like every other word is a curse. It's amazing. I can't even translate this into English because a language like Russian or Ukrainian is so much better to curse with than English is, because there are multiple words in those languages that serve more or less the same essential function as like the word fuck does in English. And so if you tried to translate this into English, literally, it would just come out as fuck, fuck, fuckity fuck. Like you can't even do it, in a way that's readable or sounds good. It's amazing.
Вот что с них, блядь. Это вся улица вокзальная, блядь. Это кадыровцы ебаные, блядь. Как пришли, блядь, сука, так и на тот свет ушли. Пидорасы ебаные, блядь. Вот что с них, блядь, поставалось, блядь. Вот что поставалось, блядь. Вот, блядь. Одни запчасти, пидоры, блядь.
Now, obviously, there are personnel casualties associated with this. I mean, it can't just be literally all the men who drove these vehicles just happened to bail on them right before this attack. Like there were people that died in this. There were Russian soldiers that died in this. Let's not be ridiculous. And it's probably a significant number. And this isn't the only such video. You can find more. There are tons. I've watched thousands of videos over the course of this war by now. You can find more like this from that period where you just see an entire street littered with burned out husks of equipment. And it just goes on for as far as the eye can see. And not only that, there are other videos that I can't play on this stream because they're much more graphic. But in addition to showing just scattered husks of Russian equipment, they also show just corpses littered across the street everywhere. I've watched so many like this. I can't play this on stream. What I'll do for you, if you really want to see this, is I'll find a few. And interestingly, you'd think YouTube would take stuff like this down, but it hasn't, provided the video is in a foreign language or is titled in a foreign language. It's something about the YouTube algorithm must be that it doesn't respond to this to it if it's in a foreign language as it would if it's in English. But there are a lot of videos, a good number that you can even find on YouTube of just like Russian corpses scattered everywhere. At one point, because I watched this video before running the stream, as they show pictures and video of this kind of stuff, they also play intercepted phone calls of Russian soldiers talking to their family members. And one of them was like, "Я столько трупов в жизни никогда не видел," which means I've never seen so many corpses in my life. So it's fairly clear that the Russians were taking immense losses in the early days of the war. I don't claim that those losses were precisely what the Ukrainian General Staff said that they were, but the evidence is abundant that the losses were high. This does not square well with the allegation that Kiev was a feint. Now, again, the purpose of a feint is to minimize your losses while distracting the enemy. But let's just keep going with this. I mean, look at this. It just keeps going.
Гандоны ебаные, блядь.
I love this guy. Гандоны ёбаные. I love it.
Это все в Буче, молодцы. ВСУ, молодцы.
Yeah, he says this is in Bucha. Also, another thing on the stream, there were some people commenting on Semiogogue's stream, expressing skepticism that I really do know Ukrainian and Russian, because when I speak English, I speak it with a nondescript American accent. Well, the title says Bucha, Kolona Kadyrovцев. It's Bucha, a column of Kadyrovites, and I know the language. Oh, God. But anyway, yeah, just look at this. It's utter devastation.
Вот что поставалось, блядь.
All right, I think you all get the point. Now, onto the further claim, a further reason why Kiev was almost certainly not a feint. The presence of elite Russian units in the Kiev offensive. And specifically, what I am referring to above all else is the First Guards Tank Army. The First Guards Tank Army is an elite Russian tank unit. In case of a war against NATO, the First Guards Tank Army is intended to be the tip of the spear. They are intended to be the first soldiers organized in an attack against NATO. They are the elite of the elite. They are among the best units that Russia has. And one of the calling cards, one of the distinguishing marks of this unit is the T-80U battle tank. Okay, and this is that tank. This is what it looks like. There are not many of these tanks in the Russian army. It produces only a few of them, and pretty much all of them are allocated to the First Guards Tank Army. So when you see T-80Us, you know the First Guards Tank Army was there. Now, if we go to the Oryx archive and we look for, hold on a minute, see, we got another lag problem again. If we look for T-80Us, we see them, right? We see them clearly. They're present. And you can get, you look at some of the earlier entries here. So I'll just open this up, for example. Okay, see the turret, the big circular organization of the turret, similar to this. It's a T-80U. Now, so this was taken on March 3rd. So this is in the midst of the so-called feint against Kiev. You're getting T-80Us annihilated, which means that the First Guards Tank Army, an elite Russian unit, is taking losses. Now, we can have a discussion. We can have a debate about the losses the First Guards Tank Army took. I don't know precisely how many they took. I don't know if those losses were as high as the Ukrainian General Staff claimed. Probably not. But here's the thing. If Kiev was a feint, why in the hell would the Russians send the First Guards Tank Army there in the first place? It's not just that you have to explain why the casualties were at some particular level. You have to explain why the First Guards Tank Army was there at all. They are among the best soldiers in the Russian army. You don't send your best into a feint. You send your best where they are actually needed. You send them into places where you expect and need to do real fighting. And if Kiev was a feint, then Kiev was obviously not that place. So why is the First Guards Tank Army there at all, irrespective of whatever the true number of casualties they may have taken might be? Now, also, furthermore, on the question of, hold on a minute, I got a bunch of tabs here. On the question of Russian paratroopers. Okay, now, let me back up a little bit and see exactly what Semiogogue says here. I don't want to put words into his mouth.
Charlemagne points out bizarre Russian paratrooper operations. I don't know that they were really bizarre, because everything that could be described as a total debacle of trying to march towards Kiev and everything else, having it not work, could just as easily be described as a feint. And if anybody else has heard differently about this, let me know. I'm aware of no significant Russian paratrooper concentrations, maybe 5, maybe 10 or something, even that.
5 or 10. Take note, 5 or 10. That is a more radical claim than even the Russian government has made. Hold on, let me find the video. Okay, this is a video posted by the Russian government. This was posted by the Russian government, and it shows Russian VDV units, which are paratroopers, landing in Hostomel, in the airport, and storming the place. Okay, here we go. I might get in trouble for the music. I don't know if it's copyrighted, but like 5 or 10, there's already more than 5 or 10 just here in this one helicopter. Again, this is not, you can't dismiss this as Ukrainian propaganda. The Russian government posted this video in the early days of the attack, in the early days of the war, to brag. Okay, so the Russian government acknowledges this. 5 or 10 already. Look, already planes destroyed, aircraft destroyed. You see it already. Hold on, there's going to be a little bit later on in the video in a couple seconds. You should see it any moment now. Sorry that I'm muting this. I just don't want, there you go. 5 or 10 paratroopers? 5 or 10, really. 5 or 10, guys. Just 5 or 10. That's all they were. Yeah. Now, Ukraine claims that there were 200 paratroopers that went just into Hostomel. I don't know if that's true, but it was some significant amount. And we know this, for example, because look, let me give you another video. This is taken by a man in Kiev, and he's watching helicopters, Russian helicopters flying towards Hostomel, including one that gets shot down.
Да слышится. Ух ты ж, елки-палки. Сбили что-то. Ё-моё. С вертолета, 2 вертолета.
He says two helicopters were shot down.
Один подбили, а второй что-то, смотри, падает.
Oh no, he says one was damaged and the other crashed.
Он подбитый, смотри, сейчас будет падать. Один уже сбили, один уже сбили.
Yeah, one's already been shot down, they damaged another. That's he's saying it again.
Садится, смотри, на поле.
You can hear more helicopters in the distance. You can hear spinning helicopter blades. There are more of them.
Сел. А там, смотри, что стоит. Дым на аэродроме.
Okay, so we got this. Now, here's another thing I can show you. This is also from Hostomel.
Блядь, их тут реально дохуя. Вот еще летят.
He's saying, fuck, there's so many of them here. And then he turns the camera and says, there are more of them coming. Look at that. Look at all those choppers. By the way, the helicopters that flew in those paratroopers to Hostomel, they were primarily either Ka-52 attack helicopters or they were Mi-8 transport helicopters. Now, an Mi-8, and if you don't believe me, you can look this up yourself, can carry up to 24 men. A Ka-52 does not have as much carrying capacity as that, but we can split the difference. We can say on average, maybe each one of these is carrying about 12 men. Okay, so yeah, there was a fairly significant concentration of Russian paratroopers in Hostomel. Was it as much as the Ukrainian government claimed? I don't know, but what we can see objectively indicates that, yeah, there was a lot, even if we don't know the exact number.
Это пиздец.
All right, well, I think that's enough to make the point. All right, so there were significant concentrations of paratroopers. Oh yeah, one final thing. These paratroopers, these are they're members of the VDV. These are Russian paratroopers. They're an elite unit. And this is another video from a man driving around in Russia past the graves of members of the VDV. This was taken sometime in either early, well, this is posted April 6th, so it was taken a bit earlier. So early April, late March, after the Kiev offensive. And their bodies had been taken back to Russia. Now, if you want to claim that this is a fake video, okay, but look, I'm not saying that these are the graves of VDV members. The guy taking the video is saying this. And if you want to dismiss this as a fake, all right, but here it is. 5 or 10 paratroopers, guys. There are only 5 or 10 paratroopers in Hostomel. I tried to find videos with subtitles, unless they were very interesting and so interesting that I just couldn't not show them. But I tried to go for videos that are at least subtitled so that people watching this know what's being said. And if they don't have subtitles, I'll translate for you, or at least give you the gist of what's going on. But yeah, look at this. Look at this.
Все, ВДВшники, пацаны.
All guys from all Russian paratroopers. Yeah, so I think you get the point. So why was Kiev not a feint? Because it doesn't look like a feint at all. Again, high equipment losses, and therefore roughly correspondingly, we have high personnel losses. We have the presence of elite units like Spetsnaz units, like members of the VDV, and verifiably like members of the First Guards tank army, which would have no business whatsoever being part of a feint. There's a further problem for the feint narrative, which is that Russian proxy fighters like Igor Girkin, Strelkov was, obviously a major leader of Russian proxies in Donbass. At the time of the offensive, at the time of the attack on Kiev, he was saying that proxy forces in Donbass had ramped up their offensive operations so that they could tie down as many Ukrainian soldiers as possible in Donbass to keep them from going to Kiev. Now, if Kiev was a feint, that is the exact opposite of what you would expect to see. The exact opposite. There's also the further problem that most people who look at the situation in Kiev have come to the conclusion that Kiev was a disaster for the Russians and not a feint. Now, it does not matter, Semiogogue. It does not matter if you think that that is an NPC level take, if you think that that is incorrect. The fact of the matter is that is what the majority of people who have looked at this believe. And given that that is what the majority of people believe, that creates a certain perception of Russia, whether accurate or not. That perception is a negative one, and therefore that perception comes with a political cost. Why would Russia be willing to incur this political cost for the sake of a feint? Okay. And this, again, factored in with the high equipment losses, factored in with the high personnel losses, factored in with the losses to their elite units, whatever the true statistics were on that. It doesn't look like a feint at all. What it looks like is that the Russians came in thinking they would take Kiev. They got beaten back. They took heavy losses. They were defeated. And then in a desperate effort to save face, they started lying. That's what it looks like. It just looks like the Russians are lying. So yeah, I mean, that's really all I have to say on the subject of whether Kiev was a feint or not. I consider this question, really, I have to be frank here, I consider this question to be the pons asinorum of the subject of the Ukrainian. If you believe that Kiev was a feint, you are extremely unlikely to have anything of value to say about this war in general. Maybe there are people who have done valuable, important, accurate, and careful analysis of this war who believe that Kiev was a feint, but I have yet to see them. Okay? This clearly was not a feint, it was a defeat. Now, given that it wasn't a feint, there are two alternative possible explanations of the feint. One is that the Russians genuinely tried to take Kiev, that it was a real military operation, and it failed. And the other is that surrender was pre-negotiated. Surrender was pre-negotiated. The Russians stormed in as part of a pretense of a battle because they wanted some fancy fireworks and pyrotechnics to go off to make it look like they were fighting, to make it look cool, to, some pageantry. But in reality, everything had been pre, and Kiev would just be surrendered. I mean, I could go on giving additional reasons to think that Kiev wasn't a feint. I mean, one thing you certainly would not do if you were arranging a feint would be to march an enormous column of men into the area where you are allegedly attempting to execute your feint. The purpose of a feint, as I said at the outset, is to risk as few of your men and as little of your equipment, particularly your elite men and your valuable equipment, while diverting as many enemy forces as possible. There's also the issue that Kiev itself has particular defenses that are unique to it, that are specific to it. It has its own territorial defense force that can't easily be moved around to other areas, that isn't really meant to be moved. And so if the Russians were attempting a feint on Kiev, like who were they distracting? Well, to a significant extent, it would be troops that the Ukrainian army can't easily move anyway. So again, it just all looks pointless. But yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Kiev was not a feint. It was a disaster for the Russians. They expected to be able to take it easily because surrender had been pre-negotiated, but the Ukrainian army had other plans. And when the Russians got BTFO'd and ran away with their tails between their legs, they made up a lie. And useful idiots in the West believed that lie. And this is sort of a segue into the next topic. Later on, as I play this stream, you're going to see Semiogogue getting angry that I accuse people of, on the dissident right, of just kind of in a knee-jerk way, sort of being anti-Western and believing whatever narrative is the opposite of whatever the West presents, because they have it in their heads as a kind of intuition that the West constantly lies. And he insists that he's not doing this. But really, I mean, what are you doing when you claim that Kiev was a feint, if not that? Because what are the arguments in favor of Kiev being a feint? Other than the claim that, well, there are two things as far as I can see it. One, the Russians didn't send in nearly enough men to take a city the size of Kiev. That's the principal argument. That, you know, obviously, if they were seriously intending to take Kiev, they would have sent more men in than they did. But as you know, I have an explanation for this. Kiev was a genuine military operation. It was a show. It was pre-planned. The city had been surrendered, and so the enormous number of men that you would need in a genuine offensive just wasn't necessary. So I have an explanation for that. I can explain an anomaly like that. You can't really explain convincingly the anomalies that I pointed to. You can't explain the high burst in the ratio of the Oryx archive in the early days. You can't explain the videos of Russian equipment being destroyed, the confirmed, visually confirmed, like paratrooper losses, the battles that took. Like, you can't explain this. Like, there clearly were large numbers of paratroopers, and even if all of them weren't killed, some significant number of them were. You can't explain that convincingly. I'm sorry. But yeah, so Kiev was not a feint. It was thought by the Russians to be a pre-planned surrender, and it turned out not to be that. Yeah, so that's that. Let's move on.
And I haven't heard anything about large numbers of Russian paratroopers being cut off and captured. So if you deploy them to a place where it seems like, in retrospect, they could have never done much, well, in the fog of war, when it's all happening and it's all, you know, happening very, very quickly in those first few days, Russia to Ukraine could easily be a feint.
No.
So I don't know that it's so weird that it requires special explanation. Same with the Kiev offensive, the idea that they never really could have taken Kiev or Kharkov. To me, and I could be wrong, I'm not saying I'm right, I don't know. But certainly the idea that these were feints that caused Ukraine to have to go deal with the possibility of these other things, at least for a time, in such fashion that it allowed Russia to make considerable and substantial gains, which they did.
Again, why has Igor Girkin said that fighters in the Donbass were trying to divert Ukrainians from Kiev if Kiev was a feint? Like, you can't explain this on that narrative.
Able to hold for the most part in eastern Ukraine, you know, that could easily have been a feint. And to me, that seems like the most plausible explanation.
It's the least plausible explanation. Okay, that more or less ends.
Maybe they say, so it's a gimme, let's just throw shit and see what sticks to the wall.
Yeah, you don't throw 40-kilometer long convoys at the wall as a gimme and take enormous losses like that. Yeah, there's a further issue with the convoys that I didn't mention that just occurred to me. One thing that happened with those columns that were marching on Kiev, the Russian columns, is that light infantry and Rosgvardia units ended up outpacing logistical trucks, artillery support, and that sort of thing. So you're marching in large numbers of men, not giving them artillery cover because the vehicles carrying that stuff are too far behind them to provide it, and this is a feint. Why would you put them at that kind of risk if you were initiating a feint? Again, just more things that don't make sense.
Maybe we'll get a freebie. It could have been that too. But the whole movement towards the capital, that seems to be a feint that got a whole bunch of Ukrainian forces involved there. Why did Russia take over so much land in the first 2 months then fall? Well, my argument is that Russia is fighting against the entire West. Yes, they haven't sent in regular troops officially, but there's every reason to believe that there's certainly mercenaries operating there, and there's every reason to believe that there are very large numbers of them deployed in areas where it's particularly important, you know, where they need people with good infantry training.
What reasons? I don't want to get bogged down in this. Again, this is not really germane to what I'm the point I want to make here. But like, the numbers that we have is that the number of foreign volunteers is somewhere between 20 and 25,000 fighting in Ukraine. And that's it. And they're not NATO soldiers. Now, I haven't heard anything outside of blatant Russian propaganda sources to even suggest that NATO forces could be fighting in Ukraine. This just seems like more lies that the Russians make up to explain away their underperformance and explain away their losses.
And unit behavior, that's integrated or integrated across units in offensive operations. They got command and control support from the West. They got satellites pointed at the region from the West. They got
yes, that's all true. I don't deny that. They're getting enormous amounts of equipment from the West. That's obviously true.
I mean, the idea that this is difficult for Russia is not there's nothing surprising about it at all. And that's one of the problems. Well, let me get through the list, and then I don't want to. None of this is an attack on Charlemagne at all. But I'm just saying there are other ways that this could be construed. Another issue is why is Zelensky constantly running around the world on a pair?
Okay. Yeah, this gets to stuff that again, it's not particularly important for me to respond to, and I'll skip ahead later. But he does at some point make the claim that he thinks that it is likely that the Ukrainians have taken more personnel losses than the Russians have. As I say, this is extremely unlikely to be true, and in support of that, I point you to the Oryx archive. That when Ukraine initiates its counteroffensive, the ratio of Russian equipment losses to Ukrainian equipment losses goes up, which is exactly what you would expect if the Russians were taking heavy losses in these offensives. And not only that, but if you watch some of this stuff in September, like, okay, there's maybe like a little blip here, little blip. But if you watch the general trend line for certain things, like in September, the artillery is dropping, right? The general trend line is going down. This looks like it's very slightly increasing. This looks just about flat. This looks just about flat. So the only way that you can reconcile this data with the claim that Ukrainians are taking heavy personnel losses in these counteroffensives is if you suppose that Ukrainians are setting up, enormous troop concentrations and just storming the Russians head on. And not only that, but they're giving these troops very little in the way of armor, very few armored vehicles. How else could you explain that there's no significant uptick in Ukrainian armored vehicle losses otherwise? So they're sending in troops without armored vehicles, and they're telling them to charge head on into an army that does have an enormous amount of armored vehicles. That's one thing we definitely know about the Russian army. They have a lot of metal. They have a lot of equipment, a lot of armored vehicles. So my question is, if it's true, if it's even close to true, that Ukrainian troop losses outpace Russian troop losses at this point in the war, please explain to me how foot soldiers are able to cause guys in armored vehicles to retreat. Like, how does that work? I can understand if foot soldiers with javelins ambushed a column of Russian armored vehicles from the side and then quickly ran away. That sort of tactic works in an ambush, but it's not going to work in a head-on assault. I mean, come on, right? So, all right, that's enough of that. I'm going to skip ahead, as I said, to the part where he addresses me more directly, and that seems like it's going to be somewhere around here. So let's go here.
And Charlemagne, I appreciate this material. I also should say that I'm not still fully qualified to judge it, and he told me repeatedly to go watch all of it first before I did.
You should have listened to him. You should have listened to him, Semiogogue. Charlemagne gave you good advice.
So, and I simply didn't have time before the stream because this.
Well, then you should have waited.
All came up after I decided to do this and scheduled it. So I still need to watch more of it. I recommend that you guys do so too. You can go look for Ivan the Heathen, no spaces. That's the channel over on YouTube. And the title of the clip is Taras Chornovil and the Secret of the Ukrainian War. However, so that's my way of saying I'm not fully qualified to judge yet, but there are a few things that I have to say that I did watch.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting.
And first off, the first guy who speaks English, Ivan the Heathen, not to be confused with whoever Taras Chornovil is. That's the guy I still haven't watched yet. Taras Chornovil is the guy who says a number of things that lead Ivan the Heathen, who you can see on screen here, to reach his conclusions. But one of the major, well, first off, I should say he's more knowledgeable about the region than I am. Obviously, speaks the languages, obviously. So yeah, he knows people there, boots on the ground, understands the culture, absolutely. So I can't fault him on that.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're at least acknowledging that and having the requisite amount of humility that would require you to have. But let's continue.
However, he does seem to be very much aligned towards. He seems to be tuned up to be someone to address the dissident right.
Tuned up. Ooh, Interesting. Tuned up by whom, do you suppose? What do you surmise may be the explanation of that? Are you, sir, insinuating that I'm CIA? That I glow in the dark? Let's keep going.
And his main focus seems to be to address the dissident right. So I'm not saying he had a brief, but if somebody who was a competent English speaker had been tasked with addressing Western dissident right support for Russia and given a brief to try to bring the Western dissident right on side, when Russia has gone to great efforts to bring them on side, I'd expect him to show up with, for example, black letter text on his t-shirt. And I'd expect him to use dissident right terminology like midwit and to fashion himself as a heathen. So he would speak to the dissident right pagans, Then again, maybe he's just diving the heathen.
Okay. Well, what do I even say to this? What do I even say to this other than, I mean, man, you haven't really made it in this game. You haven't truly made it in this game until they start thinking you might be CIA. That's what it looks like. So congratulations to me. I have arrived. People think I'm CIA now. I made it. I'm officially in the club, I guess. People think I'm CIA. That's it. Now, let's have a look at like some of the things he points to. Now he's careful to like cover his bases and say I'm not sure, but it's obvious from his mannerisms that he thinks that this is probably the case. Okay, first, the shirt, which if you've been watching, you'll notice is the same shirt. I'm wearing the same shirt again, and I did this on purpose. I did this deliberately to fuck with Semiogogue here. It's a band shirt. Coroner is a band. There was even a guy in your chat, and I mentioned this earlier, who knows the band and said it's a good band. That's it. It's just a band that I like. Okay, look, here's a music video. I'm turning off the volume, obviously, but here. Very bad quality, but here's the band playing. And hold on, they're gonna show like a close-up. All right, if you watch closely, you're gonna see like, where is it? Oh, there you go. See his shirt? He has the same thing, the same black letter text. Yeah, I guess he's CIA too. Yeah, so apparently what we learned from this wonderful learned discourse here is that if you like obscure Swiss metal bands, that means you're CIA. I also, by the way, like Hellhammer and Celtic Frost, which I guess then means that I must be visible from space. Oh boy. And I should pause here also to note, at one point later on in the discussion, a bit later, he's going to get angry at me for saying that that many commentators on the distant right, when talking about this war, reach their conclusions by the use of what I've called midwit IQ level heuristics, low to midwit IQ level heuristics. And he denies utterly and outright that this is the case. Now, I've already gone through in some detail the Kiev was a feint bit, which is already evidence that what I'm saying is accurate. But let's look at this for a minute. He's going to get indignant and angry that I accused distant right commentators of using midwit heuristics to come to judgments instead of analyzing topics in their full complexity. He's going to get angry at that. He's going to say, no, we're all galaxy brains and we never use these mental shortcuts and we always examine everything in its full complexity. But let me talk about this guy's shirt. Let me tell you about his shirt and the text on his shirt. Let me talk to you about his channel name and make insinuations about that. Yeah, definitely. Listen, Semiogogue, come on, man. Like I know that on a couple of times as you went through this little spiel, you were like, well, maybe I'm wrong. But listen, you made my point for me far better than I could have ever made it myself. So what do I even say to this? Thank you. Thank you for making my point for me far better than I ever could have made it. Thank you for doing precisely the thing that I accused dissident right commentators of doing right as you deny doing it. I mean, it's beautiful. I couldn't have asked for a better layup, dude. All right, the next thing is the channel name. All right, I'm going to explain that. I'm going to put that to rest. There are a couple of people over the years who have asked me in the comments why I have the channel name that I have, and I've explained it to them. However, I've never done so in a video. I've never done so in a way that is more public than some obscure corner of a comment section. So I'm going to explain it right now. If you open up my channel page, you will see that my channel was created way the hell back in 2008. And in 2008, I was a teenager. And like many teenagers at that time, you have your cringy, I had my cringy, edgy phase where I was into the new atheists and I thought people like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens were interesting. And in addition to that, I had watched, atheist YouTubers as well. And one of them was a guy named King Heathen, who, as far as I know, no longer makes videos and has not made videos at all in many years. And even if he did, I wouldn't watch them. That's not the sort of content I'm interested in. My views on the subject of theism and atheism have changed utterly since that time. Okay? I very clearly believe that God exists. If you look through my other videos, you can see that I've made quite a number of videos on the subject of theology, which I delve into the subject in a great deal of detail. I get into the weeds. I like that stuff. That stuff is interesting to me. So clearly the kind of cringy, edgy sort of, teenage atheist phase that I had is not, I'm just not in that phase. Okay, so the next question you may be wondering is, okay, why did you keep the channel name? And this is the part that's sort of personal. I kept the channel name because it's cringy. I kept the channel name because it's cringe, because it sounds stupid. Let me explain. Looking back on my teenage years, I can say, like many others I'm sure can say when looking back on their teenage years, that at that time I was an idiot. Okay? And that channel name is, for me, a reminder of what an idiot I was. And I want to have a reminder that I was an idiot. I want there to be some indicator of that prior idiocy and immaturity so that I know to stay humble, to always remember that there may be things I don't understand, to approach subjects with some humility and a desire to learn and a desire to learn, to accept new information, etc., etc. Basically to not be a douchebag. That's the point of the channel name. That's why I kept it. That's why it is what it is. It reflects nothing of my actual beliefs, and the reason for it is purely personal. Now, in fairness to you, there is no way whatsoever that you could have deduced this, because it is so idiosyncratic and personal to me. But that is the explanation. Okay, on we go.
Maybe he just happens to like, the band or whatever it is that's represented by Ish.
Yeah, I do like the band. Coroner is a great band. Those guys are awesome. I even said to someone who commented on that last video and who also knows the band and likes them that I saw them on tour in May, and that's where I bought the shirt. That's all there is to the shirt. There's no hidden agenda here. It's a band that I like, and this is their shirt. That's it.
Sure, it just happens to be this black light. That is possible too. I don't know, but I can't help but notice that. As you listen to him speak and reference Moldbug and Soy Boys, or Moldbug and Midwits and the Cathedral, you can see that he's tuned up specifically to address the dissident right. So if, for example, I was part of the West or Ukraine and wanted to, my remit was to try to tamp down dissident right support, I'd come on just like he did. Now, another thing is
another thing about this CIA insinuation. When I put up that last video, as a result of it, I got a boost of over 100 subscribers, which for a tiny channel like mine is quite a lot. And that boost is due to the fact that people like you made a stream about me. It's due to the fact that Charlemagne shared the video. It's due to the fact that the Prudentialist also briefly shared it on his community page. So the CIA is not propping up my channel, man. It's not. You are. You are propping it up. You are giving me additional subscribers. You are the reason that it grew in the little bit that it did since the upload of that video, for which I thank you, of course. But, come on. Like, what are you doing here?
He just opens up the beginning endlessly talking about how the dissident right are a bunch of idiots with their takes on the Ukraine. They don't understand anything. They never understand other people and their cultures. They have no idea what they're fucking talking about, and that they're all stupid.
Okay, that's an unfair characterization of it. But, nevertheless, yes, there are quite a few stupid takes. And I've already gone through some of the reasons why I regard your take in many ways, frankly, to be pretty stupid and poorly informed. So yeah, there's a great deal of it. Does it apply to absolutely everyone? Of course not. No statement like that applies to absolutely everyone. But there's nothing that I've gone over in this stream so far, and I've already watched the stream to the end, so I can kind of spoil it for you. There's nothing in the rest of what we're going to watch that induces me in any way to change that general impression. I'm sorry, I got to be honest. I got to call it like I see it.
I don't doubt that there are any number of stupid people and stupid takes out there, but I haven't heard a lot of them.
Well, you haven't listened closely enough, or you're just not examining the issue enough. Like I said, there are problems with your own take.
Even like Mercouris, who I see as being very much pro-Russia, and I think, by design, he still shares all kinds of interesting information. He still qualifies a number of things. There are areas where I don't believe it, but there are all kinds of areas where he's saying he's not an idiot. I don't buy that. He seems to, and a big point that he makes is the whole reason that everybody thinks that Russia is great and not a bag of dicks is because they think, well, if the West says it, I must assume the opposite. What? Who?
Okay. This is part of what I said, but again, a bastardization of it. The general point was that in analyzing this subject, members of the dissident right, to a wide degree, a wide range of them, not necessarily every last one, but a wide range of them, will use mid-wit level heuristics to come to their conclusions. Mid-wit level heuristics like, oh, the West lies about everything, and the casualty rates were implausible in the early days of the war, so Ukraine must be lying. But I just went through all this stuff here to give you some indicator that they're maybe not that crazy. It's not that out there. I mean, when the Ukrainians claim that Russian losses are increasing, well, we have increasing rates of visually confirmed vehicle losses as well to corroborate that. So yeah, there's like some correlation there. It's not completely insane.
I mean, yeah, there are probably actual morons and shills out there who play that game. I never said it, so I want to get this taken care of straight up right now.
Okay, let me make this absolutely clear. I don't think Semiogogue is a shill. I have nothing. There's nothing that leads me to believe that he is, but it doesn't really matter. Like he's just wrong, and that's the main point.
Said that I think Russia is going to win this conflict, and I get all kinds of fucking assets.
Okay, here we go. This is where we're going to finally get into the meat of things.
Coming in, how do you feel now? Or, you're not pro again. And the implication from this guy is that just saying it because idiots and we don't understand other cultures. I speak Turkish. I lived in Turkey for 6 years, 2 different occasions. I've almost married a Turkish woman. I studied.
Okay. Semiogogue speaks Turkish. Wonderful. Okay. I apologize to you then personally, Semiogogue. But nevertheless, to most of these commentators, my comments apply. They do. Okay, you speak Turkish. Well, if you speak Turkish, then you should be able to understand that if someone like me, who admittedly next to nothing Turkish politics, internal Turkish politics, if I suddenly went out there and I began pontificating about the politics of Turkey, you would be miffed by this, would you not? You would think, okay, who does this imbecile think he is? What is he doing talking about something that he doesn't understand? That is more or less my own reaction. And if you can understand it with respect to the question of internal Turkish politics, you should be able to make a leap of the imagination and understand how it also might apply for someone like me to the situation between Ukraine and Russia. I don't think that's hard to understand.
All kinds of European cultures, I study Turkish culture. I know about other cultures. I'm not an idiot. I don't think the things I think simply because the West said it, so I must assume it's the opposite. Like,
let's see if that's actually true. Let's really put that to the test and go through this. We'll see about that.
Just straight out imbecilic, like toddler level reverse psychology bullshit.
Okay, here's the thing though. When someone says something stupid, they're generally unlikely to know that what they're saying is stupid. Just as a rule. And so it's not going to seem to them like what they're saying is stupid. And so when someone makes the accusation that what you're saying is stupid, yeah, you're going to deny it. That's just how it is. But never mind that. Let's go through what he's about to say in detail.
No, I'm going to tell you now the very simple and straightforward reasons why at the outset I said Russia was going to win. And you can tell me if they seem unreasonable. By articulating them clearly, you'll be able to say, yeah, that makes sense, or no, that doesn't make sense, or I disagree. But the point is, none of these, not one thing that I'm about to say here has anything to do with me assuming that the West said something, so I must think the opposite.
Again, we'll see about that. However, I will be be fair to you from the outset. Semiogogue is about to give a list of reasons why he thinks that Russia will win the war. And I will examine him fairly. I'll be respectful to him as I do this. I'll do this calmly. But I'm not persuaded that there's no amount of like knee-jerk anti-Western reaction in the formation of your beliefs. I'm just not persuaded of that. And you'll see why.
Not fucking one. And now I will review them. First off, Russia has larger military relative to Ukraine and even NATO forces immediately adjacent to the territory.
Yes, on paper. And that's going to be an extremely significant qualifier on paper. But let's let him go on for a bit longer.
This is a fact. They have mobilized all of them as of like 2018. I think they were said to have 2 million in reserve. They've got a huge army. They've been successful in this area before. They've got rooms and rooms and rooms full of contingency planning and maps going all the way back prior to World War I, where they deal with the specifics of dealing with these rivers or these passes or these forests. Their war colleges are filled with people who were sold, who were raised on the pit of their previous experiences in life and death conflict in these regions. So, period. Russia has the larger military immediately adjacent. They don't need to drop them in from fast rope them down from helicopters or drop them with high altitude, low opening chutes. They don't have to ship them across the Atlantic or the Pacific. They've got to stick them on trains and trucks and drive them over there. And they've got the biggest military. This is a fact.
Okay, that's his first point. Now, I'm going to allow him to make his second point as well before I respond to it, because my response simultaneously touches upon both the first and the second point. So I'm just going to let him keep speaking for a bit longer.
Second, Russia had to rely and has had to rely more on human intelligence and cunning rather than high tech and big money than NATO, the Western powers, the United States, certainly. I assume, it's an assumption, but you can judge for yourself whether or not it's a reasonable one, that this creates more capable players. Who's going to be a more capable player? Someone who sits, behind a screen looking at various databases and all kinds of information that they pull from the digital environment, or someone who has to read whether or not someone is lying based on whether or not they start to perspire heavily on their upper lip while they're talking. Someone who has managed assets and intelligence stuff. I'm not saying that Russia doesn't have a digital side of things. I'm not saying that the United States doesn't have human, but there are relative focuses on both sides. And my understanding and expectation is that Russia has had more focus on that. That makes them less like Air Force type, intelligence officers sitting behind screens looking at whatever they can pick up on the internet, just like our police these days, who tend to get their man. But it's not because they any longer know how to do investigations. It's because as soon as there's a crime alleged, they go and unlock somebody's telephone and track everywhere they've been. It creates a certain kind of laziness. And so you can agree or disagree with my assumptions, but I'm going to state it clearly. I think that the Russians have more of a focus on human intelligence, and then that creates better intelligence players. I will also add to that Russia has been active in terms of intelligence and military. And you've got your intelligence services proper, and then you've got your intelligence services associated with their different segments or compartments of the military itself. Russia's been active there forever. They've got very significant intelligence assets on the ground in Ukraine because it was historically a Russian region. It's historically under Russian or Soviet control, and there's no doubt that those assets remain in some respects. And we're not talking about like one generation of it. Russians doubtless have files on families. They go back multiple generations, and who those families are related to and how they tended to behave. They can probably look up some player who wields power in X town or vicinity and check all the kind of crap that their grandfather got into. This is a real asset, and this does matter. I see somebody saying high tech is better. High tech is indispensable at this point, but I do not believe it is better. It is an adjunct that has to be there. And the bottom line is that Russia has that too. I'm not saying that they have it to the extent and depth that the United States does, but they've got it for real.
Okay, those are his first 2 points. Now let me begin my reply to this with a very, very, very simple question, which is, Semiogogue, how do you actually know that any of what you said is true? That's a serious question. I intend that very seriously. Okay, here's the crux of the problem. You do not appreciate at all the scale, the extent, and the degree to which corruption in the Russian army is everywhere, and it affects every aspect of its operations. Now, I can already sense what you replied. Well, of course I know the Russian military is corrupt. No, you don't. No, you don't. And I'm gonna go through it, because if you understood the things that I'm about to say, you wouldn't be making the claims that you're making with the kind of confidence that you're making them with. That confidence is not warranted at all. Okay. Now, there are various forms of corruption in the Russian military, and really, okay, if you want a full discussion of this, the gold standard here is Perun, and let's get my internet to work here. This is where we might be getting some problems. Hopefully not. Okay, things seem to be working well. Okay, the one channel that I recommend in English that is better than any other on this war is Perun. His analysis is second to none. He is fair. He is objective. He is careful. He, just excellent. And the video you all need to watch for a full discussion of what I'm about to get into Where is it? Oh, God damn it, come on. The one, where the hell is it? What the hell is this? Germany rearmament, two economies at war. No. Okay, here we go. How corruption destroys armies. Okay, this one. Watch this. Watch this for a full discussion. But for now, as I said, there's corruption at various levels. There are various types of corruption. At the highest level, you have the politicians, and they control which firms are afforded military contracts, who gets to design what systems, where research and development funding is directed. And often this is done nepotistically or just more generally than that for political reasons. Some firm it has some relation or some political connection to you, and so you award a weapons contract to them. Some firm paid a major official a bribe, and so they win the contract to design the next tank or the next body armor system or the next helicopter or whatever it is. Now that is, I would say, pretty much like garden variety level corruption. And that exists everywhere. That exists in Russia just as it exists in the United States. But as you proceed further down the totem pole, further down, you get types of corruption that would be unimaginable in a country like the United States. It would be unimaginable in any military that is basically well organized, that is basically functional, that basically works, and that takes itself and its operations seriously. Anything that's well run would not do things like this. Now, here's what I mean. Suppose you're not a politician. Suppose you're not Putin. Suppose you're not anyone in his inner circle. Suppose you're just a general in the Russian army. Well, there are things you might do something like this. You might one day, instead of taking the men under your command and having them undergo the training regiment and the training routine that they were meant to undergo that day, instead you might take them, send them over to some plot of land that you bought recently, and have them build your mansion for you, essentially conscripting them as a private labor force. Now, can you imagine this happening in the United States? Can you imagine if a general forced men under his command to build him a house, and then as they were building, he wrote down on the various forms and all the paperwork that actually these men weren't building him a house, they were going through their normal training exercises. And so everyone is fully trained just as they should be, everything is fully maintained just as they should be, and all the records reflect this. Can you imagine that happening in the US military? You cannot. There would be such outrage, there would be such an outcry, there would be fury over this. In the Russian military, it's normal. It happens all the time. People barely even think to mention it. It's perfectly normal for a general to say, right, you're coming here, I'm conscripting you as my labor force, build me a house. That's normal, okay? That is going to have an effect on the combat readiness of the Russian Army. This is also true as you go down lower, you go down to lower ranks, lower ranking officers, like colonels. Okay, you don't have, if you're a colonel in the Russian military, you don't have the pull of a general. You don't have the salary of a general, certainly. You don't make the kind of money that they make through their corrupt deals and so forth in their negotiations about weapons contracts. But you can still do a few things to secure a fair, nice life for yourself. One of these might be, if your unit is scheduled to receive a shipment of weapons or other equipment, you can take a portion of those weapons and simply steal them. You steal them, you sell them off somewhere, and then you pocket the money yourself. And then when you have to fill out forms about your equipment stocks, you just say that, perhaps you could say that a certain portion of the equipment never arrived, or that it arrived damaged, or that it was damaged during an exercise and therefore rendered unusable. The other thing is you could just lie and say that the equipment is there when it really isn't. There's any number of things. There are hundreds of permutations on this. But basically, you take the stuff and you sell it and you pocket the money, and then you lie to everyone that everything else is fine. Then as you go down even lower, let's say you're a supply officer. You can do much the same thing. If you're a supply officer in the Russian military, your salary's probably shit. You probably don't make much at all. But you do in a certain way, wield a lot of pull because you can control where equipment is sent to and how much equipment is sent where. And so if you are enterprising, if you are clever, and especially if you look around you and you see that all of your higher ups are criminals and thieves, you can say to yourself, well, why can't I get in on some of this action? And then you start stealing. And it goes on like that. But finally, we get down to the most important point, which is at the level of the ordinary conscript, the ordinary private. And this person, although having no formal political power, although having no influence that's significant in any kind of political or military circles, although being paid absolute garbage and being treated like absolute garbage by all of his higher ups, nevertheless possesses the power to completely destroy the combat potential of the Russian army. And this is how. You do it basically in two ways. You do it by stealing everything that isn't nailed down, and you do it by simply not doing your job. So, for example, let's say that your commanders, your higher ups, tell you to go and do a maintenance run. Drive around a BTR for a bit, because if it sits idle, the machinery stops working, and you might not be able to start it if it isn't used after a while. So go drive it around, or go clean the inside of a tank, make sure it's well oiled up, make sure the sights are working. They assign you regular maintenance work. You don't feel like doing that maintenance work. It's Russia. It's cold outside. It's like -10 degrees. The only way you're warm is if you have fur on your nuts. So you don't feel like doing that. And instead, what you do is you stay inside where it's nice and warm, and you take all the forms and you write down that you did all the required maintenance work, even though you didn't. And then you sit there and you feel like a genius because you got one over on your boss. And now you take that and then add to it the fact that, well, maybe you do go out to that tank, but instead of cleaning the optics, instead of testing them out to make sure they work, maybe you steal them. Maybe you rip out the wiring out of a fuel truck. Some of the electronic warfare equipment has precious metals inside of it, bits of precious metals. Maybe you can take that out. Maybe you can break apart some of the circuitry and take out some valuable materials and sell that for money on the side and augment your meager salary. Now take that and multiply it times 1,000,000. And that is how you can annihilate the combat effectiveness of the Russian army. It's death by 1,000,000 cuts, like that. So when you go out and you say, and by the way, all the records are falsified. They all say that everything's fine, but meanwhile, everything is in complete disrepair. So when you read all this stuff about, the Russian army, they have these wonderful weapons, and they have these excellent intelligence networks, and they have all this stuff that they can use, and they have this enormous army that they can conscript. Well, about the enormous army, first of all, yes, on paper, they do have an enormous army. Do they have sufficient amounts of equipment to properly equip them? Do they have enough material for that? The answer is almost certainly not. Do they have enough functional equipment to give them what they need? The answer to that is most likely hell no. And it is for the reasons that I've mentioned. Now, I can just go through a few recent stories. Take this, for example. Where did they disappear to? Russian MP says 1.5 million military uniforms are missing. This happened just recently. This was published just yesterday, in fact. It was discovered that 1.5 million winter military uniforms in the Russian army are missing from warehouses, are missing from where they're supposed to be. How did this happen? Everyone's asking, where did the uniforms go? I'll tell you where they went. Over the years, bit by bit, little by little, privates or perhaps supply officers or other relatively low-ranking people started stealing these uniforms and then writing down on the official forms that they were actually still there. They stole them, they put them for sale on eBay, and they pocketed the money. And maybe if there was someone higher up the chain than them who needed to allow them to do this, maybe they throw a little kickback to bribe the guy higher up so he stays quiet and he doesn't say anything. That's the Russian army. That's where those uniforms went. Let me show you a few other things to sort of demonstrate this. This next clip, I'm almost at a loss for words about this. The only thing I can say, quite bluntly, is this is fucked. This is absolutely fucked. Even by Russian standards, this is fucked. Okay, watch this. I've never seen anything this ridiculous. But here we go.
Возле костра сразу же им пизда будет. Так, потом что? Спальники. Однозначно будете спать, где придется. Спальники однозначно. Плюс туристические коврики или замена. Ну поняли, да, все? Это все свое, мальчишки. Вам форму, все, что армия. Вам броню, вот это все, что касаемо военного. Этого ничего нет. Наших мужиков мы сами все укомплектовали. По медицине тоже. Отсрачки, то есть лапирамиды, перекись водорода обязательно. Жгуты. У меня на вас на всех жгутов не хватит. Мы мужиков...
Let me pause this for a second. The video calls them harnesses. It means tourniquets. The Russian army doesn't have tourniquets to give its conscripts.
Аптечки, блядь, с этих, как его, автомобильные аптечки потрошите, берите оттуда жгуты. Так, мужики, только не ржать. Жен, девушек, матерей просите, прокладки. Самые дешевые прокладки, плюс самые дешевые тампоны. Тампоны знаете для чего? Нет. Пулевое ранение, прям туда вводите и все, он начинает...
It seems to have frozen on me.
Разбухать и придавливать стенки. Мужики, я это еще с Чечни знаю. Прокладки обязательно, ну дешевенькие. Понятно? Вам туда все сгодится, сейчас сырая погода. У меня там мои друзья, мои товарищи. То есть вот эту всю информацию нам скидывают это.
Okay, I think that's enough. I think you get the point. The Russian army cannot give diarrhea medicine, tourniquets, hydrogen peroxide, basic medical supplies, and sleeping bags to its men. It's telling them, go ask your wives, your girlfriends, and your mothers to give you maxi pads. And then, if you get shot, if you have bullet wounds, put a tampon into the bullet wound. Does this sound to you like a well-equipped army? Does this sound to you like they have enough equipment to give millions of men, the millions of men that allegedly on paper they can mobilize? It's a joke. No, they can't. They're telling them, I can't stress this enough, they are telling them to plug bullet wounds with tampons. Whoa. But you know, this is Russia. This is Russia for you. Only you, Russia. Only you. And we can go further. Here's more. Here is a mobilization camp where they just put beds right out into the forest. Okay, that's enough of that. I try to get the point. Moving on, here's another example. Look at these amazing conditions. These mattresses look like they're decades old. Look at this. Yeah, these are Kabardians. Yeah, that's why the accent is a bit strange. Yeah. Look at that. Moving on. Oh, this. Oh, you're gonna love this. Look at the. Oh, unfortunately, Oh no, it still works. Okay, good.
Это вот где у нас умывальник.
Okay, it seems to have frozen again. Hold on.
В раковине для мытья ног. Это простые умывальники. И пошло. И, соответственно, с другой стороны такая же хуйня.
Look at that. This is a clip of the families of conscripts coming to give them food. Why are they coming to give them food? Because the Russian army can't feed them. And not only can't the Russian army feed them, but the likely reason why it can't is because if those men do have any food, if it's stored away anywhere, their higher ups probably stole it. Okay, that's why it's not there. Well, look. Yeah, I mean, these are just a few clips. These are just a few examples. But looking at this, I would like to ask you, in all sincerity, does this look to you like an army that has its shit together? Does this look to you like an army that can supply the millions of men that it allegedly has the power to conscript? No. The weapons storehouses have been stripped bare. They've been stripped completely bare. Here's another example. I forgot to play this one. This is Jesus Christ. Look at that. Does that thing even fire? This is what the Russian army is equipping these newly mobilized men with.
Ну, я ничего комментировать не буду, ребята.
You see what the guy says? I can't even comment on this. I won't even comment on this, guys. Yeah, you're damn right. What is there to say?
Ну, могу сказать лишь одно, что вроде как это дано, что вспомнили руки.
This is, I can only say, oh my God. Jesus, look at this. This is, now I'm not saying everyone gets stuff like this, but some people clearly are. And it is entirely believable to me, as I said, that the weapons and equipment storehouses have, to a large extent, been stripped bare. Much of the stuff has just been stolen. It has been stolen over the years, bit by bit, slowly. And that is how you kill off the Russian army. Death by a million paper cuts. Now, moving on to the point about the human intelligence networks, the Semiogogue links, the tangible sort of human connections, that they have intelligence assets everywhere. This is the only point that he makes that I'm going to sort of agree with. This is kind of true, but he exaggerates it. Now, with regard to certain high-value targets, major politicians at the national level, for example, Zelensky, Yermak, those in his immediate inner circle, you're right, FSB is going to send its agents, and they're going to try to win people like them over and get them on the Russian side. In fact, I think that's probably what happened. That is my whole thesis about what is going on and has been going on in this war. With high-value targets like that, even certain people in the local administration in places like the Kherson region, certain government officials, we have direct evidence that these people are Russian collaborators. I included in the pinned comment of my original video some videos showing this, where Ukrainian investigative journalists get into contact with Russian Quizlers that have been installed, that are basically intelligence assets. That does happen. That is true. However, again, as I say, Semiogogue is exaggerating this vastly. He makes it seem as if, not a single sparrow can fall to the ground in Ukraine without the Russian army knowing about it. That's nonsense. It's not like that. They don't have intelligence networks that extensive. And how do I know this? I know this because the same principles by which corruption degrades the conventional military also end up contributing to the degradation of Russia's intelligence apparatus. So the Russian army basically works like this. There is a small core of elite units comprising perhaps 10% of the men in the army who are well armed, who are well equipped, and who can fight, who are well trained. These are the elite units, people like the 1st Guards Tank Army, like the VDV, like certain Spetsnaz units. But that's 10% of the army. The rest is shit. It's shit. they are given shit. They are barely trained. And that's the Russian army. That's what it is. Because of these various factors of corruption that I mentioned. I mean, for example, let's say you're a private, right? And your sergeant or whoever, he tells you that you need to run 5 miles today as part of your training, but you don't feel like running 5 miles that day. So what do? You go to him, you pay him a bribe, and then he takes your money, he pulls out his little clipboard, and he writes down on the clipboard that you ran 5 miles even though you really didn't. And that's the Russian army. The same is true of the intelligence services. Yes, there are going to be certain high-value targets to whom the Russians pay close attention because they are important, just like the Russian army will equip certain elite units well and will train those units well. But the rest, nah, man. It's going to go into disrepair. If you're a low-level bureaucrat in the FSB and your superior tells you to follow up on some asset, you have to track that asset. You have to know what he's doing. You have to follow him around. You have to, have a constant stream of information coming in about him and make sure that all of that is up to date. That takes work. Maybe you're lazy that day. Same thing. You bribe the higher up. He looks the other way. You forge the form. You say everything is fine. Maybe you even forge a dossier. Maybe you even make up fake information about some relatively low-level, unimportant target, and you put it into the dossier. And then that becomes part of the corpus of Russian intelligence. Okay? You severely underestimate the degree to which this cripples Russian military operations. I mean, for example, if I'm correct, and the civilian government of Ukraine is basically treasonous, but the Ukrainian military is not, and decided to resist the Russians. If my thesis is correct, that there are these two governments, if you like, within Ukraine, that the generals defended Russia and decided to disobey orders from Zelensky, decided to disobey his orders to surrender and step down, and instead went out to fight. Well, then Russian intelligence, if it was as extensive as you suggest, if it was as accurate as you suggest, if it was as reliable as you suggest, the Russians should have known this. The Russians should have known that there was this fight going on, that Zelensky and his generals didn't always agree, and that there was a decent probability that the generals might rebel, and the Russians would have made contingency plans for this. But by all accounts, by all appearances, they did not. And of course, this counter-argument depends on you accepting my thesis that there was treason at the highest levels of the Ukrainian government. But the point is that this fits with what is known about the nature not only of Russian intelligence, but about the Russian military more generally. So when you say, well, they've got these developed networks, and they've got battle plans that they all studied, and they all suckled on the teat of all this complicated and abstract military strategy, bro, no, they didn't. No, they didn't. 90% of this is, to one degree or another, bullshit. Many of the generals in the Russian army, and this is admitted, got there by nepotism. They got there through bribes. They got there by paying their higher-ups to promote them, even if they're not, particularly talented. Shoigu is not a general. He's a showman. And this applies to a significant part of the Russian military structure. Not all of it, but most of it. So, you're vastly overestimating this. Let's continue.
Another one. Again, agree or disagree, but these are explicitly articulated reasons for why I said Russia is going to win. It has nothing to do with saying that the West said this, so I'm going to say that Russia is going to win because I don't agree with the West.
Okay, let me pause here. Bullshit. Okay, you claim this is bullshit. Explain something to me. We're going to play a little game here, and we're going to play this multiple times throughout this stream. The game is called Imagine if America Did That. Okay, now imagine if the shoe were on the other foot. Imagine if you were tasked with doing an analysis of the combat potential and objective state and status of the U.S. military. How would you go about doing this? Would you go to U.S. military documents and read them and simply regurgitate what's written in them? I sure as hell hope you wouldn't. I mean, that wouldn't be very good analysis. Surely you would bring to bear some more skepticism than that. You may even consult the work of writers like, I don't know, Seymour Melman or Anthony DiFilippo, perhaps, who've written extensively about corruption in the US military and the corrupt dealings involved in securing weapons contracts, and how in many cases, weapon systems are far overpriced. In many cases, the Pentagon is charged twice or even three times for the same weapon system. How, through a process called political engineering, you may be able to make it so that the factories which construct various weapon systems are all located within a particular congressional district and therefore become major sources of employment within that congressional district, thus making the senator who hails from that congressional district electorally bound to support the ever increasing expansion of the military industrial complex. You would know all of these things, and you would know the inefficiencies that they would introduce. You would introduce caveats regarding how well the US military can perform. You would bring up things like that around, I don't remember exactly, but sometime around the invasion of Iraq, so around 2001, 2002, or thereabouts, there was a pretty significant scandal in which something like $1 trillion of Pentagon spending simply couldn't be accounted for. It just vanished. Where did it go? Nobody knows. Now, you would mention things like this. You would mention things like this when discussing the effectiveness and the power of the US military. So given that you would have this skepticism, surely, on that subject, why wouldn't you have equivalent skepticism about the claims of the Russian military? Why would you just parrot with such complete confidence and I have to be honest, utter naivete, all this stuff that you just said about Russian capabilities, that they're allegedly capable to mobilize millions? No, they aren't, I promise you. That they have these extensive intelligence networks that extend everywhere. No, they don't. Maybe to some key figures, but beyond that, no. I mean, these records, if they exist at all, were probably misplaced. Like, it wouldn't shock me if, like, some general got drunk and then forgot where he put the records. Like, this is a real thing that you can expect out of Russia. So, I mean, that's the question that I have. It's bizarre to me. It's odd. Surely you would have some skepticism when analyzing the U.S. military. Surely, and when the U.S. military performs poorly relative to how it should have performed in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq, I mean, surely you would bring some of these points about corruption stymieing the American military effort to bear. And yet this is nowhere to be heard when you discuss Russia. Now, why is that? Why on earth is that? Now, one explanation may be that you simply don't know about these things. That's possible. Another explanation might be that you just have knee-jerk skepticism of Western claims, but don't have the same sort of skepticism of Russian claims, and so you approach the latter with much more credulity, which is precisely what I have been accusing you and other members of the dissident right of. So you're claiming that this is all bullshit, that I'm making this up, that this is unfair. I'm not seeing it. You haven't persuaded me that this really is unfair. You haven't, at least as a general statement. At least as a general statement.
The energy angle. The energy angle is still massive. Now, maybe it's all much ado about nothing. Maybe the rising energy prices where they're paying like $6,000 per month to try to buy electricity or pub in Britain, maybe that's not really happening. Maybe it's not going to be a big problem this winter. Maybe the gas reserves are going to be sufficient. Maybe everybody's going to stay warm. Maybe there will be no political upheaval. Maybe they won't have problems of any kind as a result of the economic stuff with Russia, but I don't think so.
Okay. I had a response for this prepared, but in many ways this is sort of moot now that Nord Stream has been destroyed. And before anyone asks, I have absolutely no idea who did it. Just to be absolutely clear, I have no idea who did it. I do not know who is responsible. I have heard various theories, and each of them have a superficial plausibility to them, but at the same time, none are entirely satisfying. For example, yeah, it sort of makes sense that the United States would do this. Perhaps the United States is afraid that that Europe might capitulate to Russia and resume purchasing large amounts of Russian gas, or will try to work something out with the Russians. Perhaps that happened. But at the same time, the Russians themselves decided to shut off the flow of gas through Nord Stream. So the Russians did for the United States what the analysis of people like Semiogogue has it that the United States would want to happen. That end has been achieved. Russian energy is not flowing to Europe. And if that's what Americans want, if that's what the American government wants, well, they have it. And they don't have much to gain from destroying this pipeline. If word were ever to get out that they were behind this, the Americans, they'd face quite a bit of political backlash and opprobrium. Surely they don't want that. So, not entirely satisfying. I have also heard theories to the effect that the Russians did this. And once again, there is a superficial plausibility to this. The superficial plausibility resides in the fact that, yes, as a matter of fact, Russians indeed are vindictive enough to do something like this. They are. They are vindictive enough to get so angry at Europe and say, fine, you don't want our gas? Bang. How do you like me now? That is totally in line with the Russian attitude. I believe that. But at the same time, obviously, it is to Russia's benefit that Europe continues to buy oil and gas from it. So would Russia be willing to hurt itself, to hurt its enemies? Yes. The question is to what extent, and that's sort of iffy. So I don't know who destroyed Nord Stream. That's my conclusion. I don't know. Don't ask me. No idea. But that makes the whole energy issue moot. Regardless, there are a few things that can be said about it. First, let's have a look at the oil price. Okay, as of right now, it's sitting at about $83. When I recorded my initial video, the price was $79. Okay, it had a little bit of a spike. Not much, these things happen. There are going to be day-to-day fluctuations, obviously. If you look at Russian Urals oil right here, it's way down in the dumps. It's at $65 per barrel, and the page isn't loading. There we go, 65.21. Then, add in the fact that even though India and China are buying Russian oil, they're insisting on buying it at a $35 discount. It becomes unclear as to whether the Russians are, even making any money on the transaction anymore. Then we've got the issue of gas. Okay, when I recorded that first video about a week ago, the price of gas was, I think, 187 euros per megawatt hour. Now it's down at just about 170. So that's going down, but it's still high, and it's significantly higher than it was before the war. We've got storage here, 88.1% of EU gas storage is filled. According to some analyses I've read, if they were to fill the storage tanks up to 100%, that should be enough to tide Europe over for about 3 months. That will last the winter. Of course, there are other things they'll have to do. There will have to be rationing. There will have to be certain areas like, theme parks or monuments or shops that are open 24 hours a day that will have gas in the winter cut off to them. There might even be rationing in people's homes. I don't deny that this energy squeeze is going to be difficult for Europeans. I don't deny that their energy bills will be higher. What I do deny is that Europe will collapse as a result, or that people will freeze in their homes, or that this is going to be something that Europe can't recover from. Europe is already scrambling and has been scrambling to secure energy, including gas, but also coal, nuclear power, and anything else they can get from as many other sources as they can get. So I acknowledged at the end of that video, and you would know this if you watched it to the end, that things will probably be difficult for Europe, but not so difficult as to collapse it, not so difficult as to make events in line with the lurid propaganda that has been put out by the Russians. But if you disagree, well, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. And if I am wrong, I will graciously acknowledge the error. Let's go on.
And that's a massive blow, that economic weapon. Think about the sanctions that have been put on Russia and the effects that they seem to have had thus far, which are not insignificant and not non-existent, but they have not succeeded in taking Russia down, or even the political regime there down.
If you believed that economic sanctions of whatever strength would take down the Russian political regime, you are hopelessly naive and you don't understand Russia. To put this rather bluntly, Russians do not care about being poor. The main thing for them, the thing they care about more than anything else, is that Russia be feared. And if that means that they have to suffer poverty, so be it. Russians have an extraordinarily long history, a centuries-long history of enduring humiliation after humiliation after humiliation. And they just keep enduring it from their political leaders. These people are used to being poor. They're used to being oppressed. They're used to being treated like shit. This is nothing new to them. So, yeah, it's had an effect. But the primary purpose of Western sanctions, or what should be thought of as their primary purpose, is to cripple Russian military capacity, which has shown signs of success. I mean, Russia imports virtually all of its precision components, virtually all of its machine parts that it uses to build not only precision weapons, but even civilian and military vehicles. And so correspondingly, Russia's capacity to build these things has drastically decreased. It's gotten to the point where the Russians are now cannibalizing other vehicles for parts and using them, in still other vehicles. This is a sign. Now, I don't expect the sanctions to collapse the political regime, and never did. But this has had an effect on Russia, and you can tell this in various ways. I'm going to discuss this subject in more detail in the video that I originally planned to make on this topic. But there are some pretty blatant indicators that you can use to see this. I mean, for example, Russia, since the imposition of sanctions, has refused to publish certain critical economic statistics. Why do you think that is? When governments suddenly refuse to publish critical data, critical economic data, like, exports and imports and things like that, when they suddenly stop publishing them, it's not because the economy is doing well, But as I say, I'm not going to discuss that in full detail here. That's all I'll say about that subject for now. So I simply disagree with you on the economic angle, but time will tell which of us is correct. And if it turns out not to be me, that's fine. Then I was wrong.
Now compare that to what is likely to come this winter, and ask yourself whether or not what's going to happen to Europe, and as a consequence to citizens of European countries, and as a consequence of that in turn to regimes in Europe, and whether or not they stand or fall or get replaced.
Well, again, the destruction of Nord Stream kind of makes that moot, even if some populist government comes to power, which, in some areas I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to. But if it does come to power and then tries to seek some rapprochement with Russia, well, that's going to be difficult given that, given the damage sustained to these pipelines. I know the Russians have said that they're trying to repair them, but who knows how long that will take, and even whether the attempts at repair will be effective. Time will tell. This is all too early to say.
Ask yourself whether or not, on the absolute scale of things, ask yourself whether European countries and NATO countries, other than the U.S., and even the U.S. to some extent, are going to get hurt as badly or worse than Russia is by this.
Okay, well, yeah, they're probably going to get hurt, but not nearly as badly as Russia. Furthermore, and I direct your attention again to Perun, who has done an excellent video on, this one, 6 months of war in Ukraine, economics, endurance, and
gone down by 6.
Sorry about that. Economics, endurance, the energy war. He goes through this in exhaustive detail. I won't cover everything, but there is a section in which he discusses popular support for Ukraine in European countries, popular support for arming the Ukrainians, popular support for continuing sanctions on Russia. It's pretty high in Europe. Like the Europeans, God bless them, even though they don't have to. They seem to be largely willing to do this. They seem to be willing largely to endure this.
Now, you can agree, you can disagree, but this is an explicitly articulated reason why, at the outset, I believe that Russia would come out of this ahead. There's also the presence of Russian historical enclaves. So let me just go over this, right? This guy, Ivan the Heathen, is like, no, it doesn't have anything to do with what NATO has done.
That's not my view. Now, in fairness, later he's gonna walk that back and correct it. I don't say that NATO is brainless. I have never said that NATO is brainless. I have never said that NATO bears no responsibility whatsoever for this war. My position, and I've made this clear, is that it bears some responsibility, but not the lion's share of it. The lion's share of it goes to Russia. But again, Semiogogue is gonna walk this back in a minute. So, yeah, he corrects himself later.
I know about 2014, but there was always going to be this war in Russia.
I know about 2014. Are you implying that that it's obvious that Russia is not to blame for 2014? I'm not going to discuss 2014 here. It'll derail this stream and make it far too long. But Yeah, Russia was largely responsible for that as well. But again, different subject.
Russia was always going to cause it. No, I just don't buy that. Yes, Russia was always aware that this war could happen, but you go back to fucking 1991, and you can see.
Okay, let me just pause very briefly here. I'm going to play Semiogogue's stream and allow him to give his full explanation. It may take a while, but I want him to say everything. I want him to get it out there, and I'm not going to interrupt him as I do it. So here goes. And after that, then I will respond.
Beginning of the steps that led to this, and it wasn't Russia that took them. So this guy, Ivan the Heathen, again, seems in.
Well, we'll get into that. Sorry. All right, I'll let it play. He's going to pull out a map, and he's going to give a whole elaborate argument for why Russian strategic concerns about NATO expansion are what's truly motivating this war, or what is ultimately motivating this war.
Intelligent, very well spoken. I'm not saying that I know in any way that he's a shill or something like that. I have no idea.
Of course you don't know. How on earth could you know? You don't. You're just insinuating it because I disagree with you. I mean, let's be honest here. That's what this is.
Sure of it that he could be. Don't know that he is. He does sound articulate. He's highly intelligent. He speaks the right languages to translate the material, and he speaks with the right slang to reach the dissident right. However, he's black.
Maybe that's because I'm sympathetic broadly to the dissident right, and this issue, the Ukrainian war, is one where I disagree with the dissident right, and that's why I've said the things that I've said. Maybe that's the explanation.
Flatly, in my view, wrong. Maybe there's something else I need to see. Charlemagne told me to watch all of it. Still haven't done it yet. But as best I can tell, he's flatly wrong.
You should have, and then you would know that even in that video, everything wasn't there.
In claiming that, NATO had a little bit to do with it, but this was really Russia. There was always going to be this fight. NATO, didn't play that big a role in it. All you have to do is go over here to this map of the region, right? And 1991, as I've talked about many times, those who've watched my other clips will know about this, right? But I'm just going to go over it again. You've got Kaliningrad, right? And you've got Transnistria right here. This right here is the skinny waist of Europe. If you have a territory that can be difficult to defend along here because it opens up to the Trans-European plain, right? And you want to find some way to defend it where you're not going to have to, add an extra 2,000 miles of your forces in order to defend it. Well, this is the narrow spot right here. And from earlier than 1991, but for our purposes, from 1991 forward, you got Kaliningrad here, just so happens to be right at this point to draw a line to make the narrowest division. And you've got Transnistria right here. Must just be a coincidence, right? Must just be a coincidence that since 1991, Russia knew that they were likely to get hit here by a resurgent NATO as the Soviet Union either did collapse from within or appeared to do so. I tend to go with the latter interpretation. Nevertheless, they were unable to assert themselves for quite some time. In fact, from 1991 all the way up to the business with when did the Russian paratroopers? Oh, right. When did that happen? Let's see. God damn it! I pulled up the wrong one. 1999. So for 8 or 9 years, Russia was in a position where it could not stop what was happening in terms of collapsing before eastward expanding NATO. And yet, what did they do? Knowing, and I've talked about this before, forgive me if you're part of the viewers who have already seen this, but what did they do anticipating that? They made sure they had Kaliningrad. They, from the very first beginning, 1991, they had this Transnistria thing, which was always a breakaway region. That allows them a little beachhead here and a little beachhead here. If they need to, they can try to connect the dots here, far enough forward to give themselves some buffer room, and to, in theory, have it be the narrowest part of this width of Europe so that they would have to, deploy fewer armies along this line than they would, for example, if they had to do it over here. If I were to just draw, just stretch a piece of string along this border that I'm tracing here with my cursor, and then I was going to draw a string here, and then I pulled this one over here taut, you would find that this might be as much as double the length of the front they would have to defend here. Look at what else they've done. They've, we had in the 1850s, we had the Crimean War here, which means this has been a big thing for the West to try to keep Russia bottled up here and control them. Look at Georgia. When they tried in 2008 to take the Georgian military highway, which they called South Ossetia. Now, if you get down on it, South Ossetia does not exactly parallel Yermolov's old Transcaucasian military highway, but it's immediately adjacent to it, and there's an alternate route through similar passes right in that area that and I might not have my cursor in just the right spot, so forgive me, I probably don't. It's very rightly. But basically, Georgia, under pressure from figures like Soros and other Western money, attempted to roll in and say South Ossetia is their territory, and they're going to put their troops there, and they're going to move up. It wasn't Ossetia that it was about. It was about this path through the mountains, and this mountain chain is the southern wall of Fortress Russia. And so that was the first attempt that, or one of the many attempts that NATO made to attempt to peel Georgia off and these other countries that were part of their satellites. And we had the business with Abkhazia, and Russia backed them against Georgia. And then Russia said, no, you know what we'll do? We'll just recognize the independence of Abkhazia, even though historically we were enemies, and we'll back them against Georgia. We'll create a frozen conflict there, and then we've got a place where we can put troops if we needed to. So they kept Abkhazia, they kept South Ossetia, they kept this sort of presence with Nagorno-Karabakh and the rest with Armenia and Azerbaijan. They kept Crimea, they kept Transnistria, they kept Kaliningrad up here in the north. So as of 1991, and repeatedly over the years since then, they've kept their positions based upon their strategic needs for defense, and they have they planned it well in advance. So what is this? What the fuck is this? Only stupid and naive people care about what Russia wants. I don't mind if you're Polish. I don't mind if you disagree with me. I don't mind if you are against Russia, so to speak. But that statement is just stupid. If you're attempting to analyze a conflict, then you have to understand what the needs and motivations of the various players are. So let's put you in timeout until you learn to say something that isn't just stupid. Anyway, the point is the idea that this is all Russia, and they were always going to they're always going to do this, and that NATO has nothing to do with it. No, it's the same old fight that's always been there. Russia needs to control it. Basically, I was hoping that we could have Jimmy Thomas on here so that he could discuss this. But once you map it out from an operational level, these areas of eastern Ukraine, once you get past this Donbass and this industrial area in the east, it's basically a straight shot, whoop, straight up to Moscow until you basically hit the ring road. So in addition to this wide front kind of aspect, in addition to the fact that it's only up here when you get into the north that you have marshes and other things that act as barriers, all down along and through here, you've got huge open areas, multiple routes that land forces could take to attack Moscow. And Moscow's been ready for it because it's as old as time that these are issues, and it's as old as time that whether we're talking about the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union or the new Commonwealth of Independent States, whether it was Bessarabia before or Moldova now, whether it was Gdansk and the rest or Kaliningrad or whatever the damn, I guess Gdansk doesn't exactly apply, but what was this called? Königsberg, I believe. No matter what we're calling it on the map, it's the same set of strategic issues that are timeless. And what has NATO been doing? It has been expanding endlessly since then. But do I need to remind you that also Turkey as a NATO proxy has gone in here to try to break things up with Armenia? Likely Turkey, one of the possible candidates for who did it, is Turkish intelligence services and connections with Kazakhstan trying to affect things there. There's just been an endless sequence of provocations. We've also got, Sweden and Finland's accessions to NATO. If I'm remembering that right, Finland's one of them. I think, yeah, Sweden is the other one, if I'm not mistaken. It's just endlessly pushing in and chiseling in on Russia. And past the points that they consider to be strategic lines that you don't cross because they'll play hell under a scenario of full-scale war and mobilization with defending themselves. So, this guy just flat out seems to be full of shit when he's like, oh, NATO has nothing to do with it, or NATO. No, I'm sorry, he didn't say that. He said he doesn't believe NATO is the only reason, and he believes that Russia is the primary cause of this. Also, he's got some other things that I don't really buy, which is, this notion that.
Okay, that's enough for now. Okay, Semiogogue, that was very nice. That was very nice. But there's a teensy weensy little problem with it, with everything that you outlined. And that is this. It's all irrelevant. It's all completely irrelevant. And I will explain why. You can see this very easily with a simple thought experiment. Those of you who've my stuff know I'm a fan of thought experiments. Here you go. Here's another one that will help illustrate the principle that I want to get at very easily. Suppose that on February 23rd, 2023, NATO had decided to just disband. They just, this whole global homo thing, we're not really feeling it anymore. We're going to disband. Suppose NATO did that. Now, do you think that in the face of this, Russia would be more likely to attack Ukraine or less likely? And in fact, that's even too qualified a question, because from his mannerisms, from his demeanor, from the way he talks about this, I can deduce, or at least it seems to me, that he believes that NATO is entirely to blame for this and that Russia has no blame to share at all. So really, the question should be, do you believe that Russia would have attacked Ukraine at all if NATO had disbanded or not? Now, if you believe that NATO is entirely to blame for this conflict, then the answer to that question on your part must be no. If you believe that NATO only shares a relatively small portion of the blame, or a relatively large portion of the blame, but Russia shares a relatively small portion of the blame, then you have to say that it would be less likely. Maybe the probability isn't zero or close to zero, so close to zero as to be negligible, but less, that there would be a lower probability that Russia would invade Ukraine if NATO had decided to disband. Good luck trying to make that argument. That's what you would have to prove. Because, and here's why. Because if NATO were to disband, if NATO doesn't exist anymore, then Russia does not need to protect itself from an attack by NATO. There no longer is a NATO. And so it doesn't need that buffer zone. Do you think that in the wake of that, Russia would go to Ukraine and say, okay, Ukraine, never mind, we were going to invade because we needed to for our security, but now NATO is just not a thing anymore. We don't have to worry about NATO expansion. Okay, you guys can be independent. You go have fun. They're not going, they would never say that. Never. And the reason why, fundamentally, to nail it down and make it simple, is that Russia believes that the mere existence of Ukraine as an independent nation, the mere existence of Ukrainians as an independent people, as independent from Russians, as different from Russians, Russia takes that as an insult. Russia considers that to be a rupture to the civilization of historic Rus, as they term it, and this is a rupture that must be resolved. Ukrainians, according to the view of most Russians, are part of the Russian nation, belong as part of the Russian nation, and must be assimilated into the Russian nation. Now, I do not deny that strategic considerations also play a role in Russia's attitudes. I do not deny that things that NATO does might cause Russia to have to react in various ways. Yes, it is true that geopolitical realities will hem in Russia's behavior. It is true that the game of imperialism must be played according to certain strategic rules. But nevertheless, that is ultimately the game that Russia is playing. And not only with respect to Ukraine, but with respect to these other areas that you mentioned, with respect to Kaliningrad, with respect to the portions of Georgia that Russia annexed, with respect to the eastern regions of Ukraine, with respect to everything. Because, see, here's the problem. You have already decided, Semiogogue, you've already decided that Russia must and can only have strategic concerns and no other concerns when deciding upon its foreign policy. And so you interpret all of its behavior in terms of strategic imperatives. So you look at places like Kaliningrad and like South Ossetia, and you say, well, clearly this has a strategic purpose behind it. And it may well do to some extent. But there are other properties that places like Kaliningrad and South Ossetia have in common. There are other properties that the areas that Russia has annexed have in common, other than this, this strategic property that allegedly improves Russian security. And that property is this. They are small areas with weak militaries that are easy to conquer. That's it. Russia is playing the game of imperialism. And not only the game of imperialism, but the game of easy imperialism. The game of imperialism where it really doesn't have to do much, and where it focuses on conquering small areas so as not to provoke too great a reaction from the European powers or from NATO. So it's playing a kind of careful imperialism, a kind of semi-restrained and hemmed-in imperialism, an imperialism hemmed in by geopolitical realities. But nevertheless, we're talking about imperialism here. Now, I want to show you a few clips, okay? I want to play a few things to help illustrate this point. And when I make my full video on the war, I will go into this in far greater detail. But I'm going to do a few things just to sort of get this point across. Okay, right here, we will see a clip from Anton Krasovsky, who is a Russian propagandist. He's a major figure on Russian state TV. And this, I believe, was when he was, giving he was shooting a podcast episode or something. But this is a clip of him, and this is him speaking. You can see the subtitles, and it speaks for itself. I'm just going to play it.
Сука, этой страны не должно быть. И мы сделаем все, чтобы ее не было. И я вам, блядь, говорил, мы сожжем вашу конституцию, блядь, прямо на Крещатике. И, блядь.
Okay, I should pause to say, these subtitles do not translate his profanity. They don't include his profanity, which is considerable. There's a lot of swearing in here that you're not going to be able to read in the subtitles.
Я сам туда приеду. Вы меня звали, блядь, после этого. Приезжайте, блядь, если слабо, хуй тем не вырос, блядь. Вы, сука, все уже сидите, блядь, кто в Чехии, кто, сука, блядь, в Германии, кто мне это говорил. Вот я, блядь, вам говорю, я, блядь, лично буду присутствовать на сожжении вашей говняной, так называемой конституции прямо, блядь, на Майдане Незалежности. Сука, этой страны...
Okay. Now, quick question. How does Krasovsky's demeanor strike you here? Is he saying, oh, we really don't want to conquer Ukraine. We really wish that we didn't have to do so. We're really doing it reluctantly. But listen, we've got strategic imperatives here. We've got to defend ourselves. Or is he instead saying, you people don't have a right to exist apart from us? You are not a real nation. You have no right to your independence. You belong to us. Your place is as our colony, and we will conquer you and do what must be done to make it so that you are under our heel. What is the impression you get? Now, I emphasize again, Krasovsky is not a nobody. He is a regular on Russian state TV. Let's move on. Let's play something else. Oh, here we go. Vladimir Solovyov. Also talking about Ukraine here. Also with subtitles. Here we go.
Нерушимость границы установить СССР. Вообще, что они выдумывают? Вот мы никогда не признаем Украину. Да Украина там существует 31 год. Ну и не будет существовать больше. Ну какая разница? Как сказано у Николая Васильевича Гоголя. Я тебя породил, я тебя убью. Ну и все. Какая нам разница вообще? Все эти заверения, все эти верещания, все это клоунада, ну, не признаете. Мы никогда не признаем. Да кого нахрен волнует ваше никогда? Ну и не признавайте. А мы признаем. Вот так. Нерушимость границы.
Explaining again. Again, what is the impression you get from that? He's basically saying Ukraine does not have a right to an independent existence apart from Russia. And this is a widely shared sentiment among Russians. I am not cherry picking this. The majority of Russians believe this. Even so-called Russian liberals, the so-called opposition to Putin, even among them, it is virtually impossible to find anyone who does not speak about Ukraine in deprecatory terms. Virtually impossible. Because they don't regard Ukraine as a real country. They don't regard it as a legitimate nation with its own history and its own language. They don't believe that it has a right to exist. They believe that it belongs as a Russian colony. Let's keep going. Here's another clip. This one is particularly revealing. I should pause before I start this. It is a characteristic of Russian propaganda on Russian state TV that they will sometimes present one person who takes the opposite line from what everyone else is taking, so that everyone else in the room can gang up on that one person, and in that way, the narrative presented, at least for that time, by Russian state TV can be affirmed even more intensely. So let's just watch.
Нужна все-таки какая-то ясность в политическом решении украинского вопроса. Но надо признать, на мой взгляд, что украинский народ существует. Это первое, надо признать.
So he's saying the verboten thing. We need to admit that the Ukrainian people do exist. This is like a shocking admission for the Russians.
Не согласен с тем, что мы должны Украине предложить какую-то альтернативу. Такую альтернативу
I disagree that we should offer Ukraine some type of an alternative. Listen to this.
Предлагали, начиная с 91 года. Все постсоветское существование и было предложением такой альтернативы. Мы подарили вам государство, которого у вас не было.
We gave you a country you did not have before. Do you hear this? Again, you're not a real people. You exist at our behest, and we can destroy you and conquer you whenever we feel like, because you're not a real nation. You're not a real people. You're our dumb little brother that we have chosen for the time being to treat with kindness, but we may in the future change our minds. This is the Russian attitude toward Ukraine.
Не было как народа, мы подарили вам ощущение того, что
you didn't exist as a people. We gave you the feeling that you are a people. Do you see this? As if Ukrainians didn't have this on their own to begin with.
Вы народ.
По поводу признания наличия украинского народа. Это самая большая ошибка, которая существовала.
Recognizing the existence of the Ukrainian people was the biggest mistake in our Soviet history. Again, do you see this?
Советской истории. Это все марксисты сделали.
The Marxists did that. Yeah, you have no genuine history. You're completely artificial. You're not real. We're saying this over and over.
Ну, то есть нет украинского народа.
Нет. Украинского народа нет.
There you go. There it is. as blunt as you could possibly ask for. The Ukrainian people do not exist. Украинского народу нет. There it is.
Вам скажет любой историк вам это скажет, что его не существует. Просто признать существование. Спасибо. Откажусь.
А украинский язык есть?
Украинский язык есть? Oh, great.
Украинский язык, есть диалект украинский, конечно.
Это же русский диалект.
See, it's not a language, it's a Southern Russian dialect. That is the Russian attitude in a nutshell. If you don't know this, then you simply don't know the terrain. You simply don't know what we're talking about if you don't acknowledge this as a factor in the stoking and the outbreak of the war. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. The existence of an independent Ukraine is considered by Russia to be an insult. Furthermore, there is a very specific type of nationalism that Putin has revived in Russia, especially since 2012. And I will be discussing this in more detail later in the video that I intend to make. But very briefly, part of that nationalistic myth that he constructs is this idea that Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities, and that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the three Eastern Slavic peoples, as he puts it, all share a common civilization, that they are a common people. And if Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities, then it looks a bit awkward to see that Kiev is actually located outside of the borders of Russia. This tends to undermine the narrative presented by the Russian state, the current justificatory myth of the Russian state as it exists now. And so Russia, in the end, in the final analysis, ultimately cannot allow Ukraine to exist as an independent nation. Now, that does not mean that they will just do whatever they want at any given moment and attack Ukraine at any given moment. As I said, rules, strategic considerations, geopolitical imperatives will constrain the behavior of Russia, will affect when Russia does or does not attack Ukraine, when it considers it to be optimal or not optimal to carry out such an attack. But the fact that it has this desire is indisputable. And if you do not know this, if you do not acknowledge this as a significant contributing factor to the outbreak of the war, then you simply don't understand the region. I do not deny that strategic considerations and security concerns play a role in Russian behavior, but the ultimate goal is the capture of Ukraine, period. And it will be achieved by the Russians, or to be achieved how I think it can be, in whatever way is the easiest. Which is why I brought up my earlier question, and I will repeat the thought experiment again. If NATO were to disband, if it had disbanded on February 23rd, would Russia be more or less likely to invade Ukraine? Of course, it would be more likely. And if it would be more likely, that means that however significant a consideration that NATO expansion might be for Russia, it is not the primary consideration. Now, if this doesn't satisfy you, let me give you another argument, another brief thought experiment. I would be willing to accept a compromise agreement between Ukraine and Russia, in which Ukraine pledges neutrality and agrees not to join NATO. Now, this will never take place. This is not going to happen. This is purely hypothetical, obviously, because Ukraine has already petitioned for NATO membership. But I would accept the following hypothetical agreement. In fact, not only would I accept it, I actually consider it to be better than Ukraine joining NATO. I would prefer this. I would prefer what I'm about to describe to Ukraine joining NATO. The agreement is this. Ukraine promises Russia that it will not join NATO. It promises neutrality. It promises to remain as a buffer zone between NATO and Russia, but only if two conditions are met. Condition number one, Ukraine gets nukes. Ukraine gets nuclear weapons. That's the first condition. The second condition is that Russia pledges never in any form or fashion to interfere in Ukrainian elections. And if it does so and is detected to have done so, then Ukraine reserves the right to unilaterally withdraw from this agreement and join NATO if it wishes to do so. I would accept that compromise. If the Russians were willing to offer that in exchange for neutrality, I would say go for neutrality. In fact, in some ways, that would work out better for Ukraine because if it had nuclear weapons, it could secure independence both from Russia and from the West. It could be a truly independent country and wouldn't be imposed upon in any way by either of these two larger powers. So obviously, as a Ukrainian, I would prefer it. Now, here's my question. Do you think that Russia would accept this compromise? The answer is obvious. Hell no, it would not. No way in hell would it accept this. Now, if Russia's primary concern was preventing NATO expansion, if it was not to conquer Ukraine, if their primary desire was not for imperialism, for conquest, for territory, for control, if they didn't want to simply, dominate and own another country, then the Russians would accept this deal. They would forego the lesser desire to conquer and control Ukraine in favor of gaining the allegedly greater desire, which is security from NATO expansion. Russia will never take such an agreement. They will never accept something like that. And that is proof that NATO, while bearing some responsibility for this war, is not the primary cause. The primary cause is the Russian imperialist and expansionist impulse. It is the Russian inability to understand that Ukraine is an independent country and is not a Russian colony and does not belong as a Russian colony, that they have no right simply to conquer it and control it. That is the cause of this. That's it. Now, furthermore, on the issue of Russia behaving allegedly in such a way as to guarantee its strategic interests and preserve its security against NATO, frankly, I don't understand how invading and conquering Ukraine would help to augment Russian security. I don't see it, frankly. I don't see it because, well, suppose Russia did invade Ukraine and suppose they did conquer Ukraine. I mean, wouldn't that provoke a massive reaction from NATO? Clearly it would. Clearly NATO would arm and expand. In fact, the attempt to conquer Ukraine has already provoked a massive expansion. Finland and Sweden, two countries who previously had pledged neutrality, had pledged not to join NATO, have rethought their pledges and have joined. And so simply by virtue of that alone, if you want to insist that Russia's primary motives for this invasion are its strategic imperatives, are its desire to preserve its security, this war has been a failure, unequivocally. It's been an utter failure. But again, it's not clear to me how conquering Ukraine would even augment or improve Russian security. Of course, NATO would react if the invasion was successful. NATO reacted even though it wasn't successful. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what I have to say about that. I don't deny that NATO expansion is a concern. It is not the primary concern, however. If you disagree with this, I simply have to say, look, you just don't understand the situation. That's what it comes down to.
That Russian propaganda does one thing, and it's just to really say nothing and confuse everyone.
Oh, okay. Now this is the part where he talks about Russian propaganda and what I said about Russian propaganda. Okay.
Well, there's no real aim to Russian propaganda. They just want to confuse you and the rest. So I've seen that. I've seen a very consistent pattern of Russian propaganda. I see them, Russian accounts posting things of, that kind of suggest solidarity between Russian rednecks and Western ones, where they're guys in Russia who like to tailgate and they try to get a hold of big American trucks and they even wear like trucker hats and, boots, and they look the rest like an American redneck designed to appeal to Southerners. I've seen Russian groups that are, supposedly grassroots clips that just appear, and it's some Russian guy playing Dixie, or, guys who are, it turns out later it appeared that one guy was a former communist or whatever, but a guy who's in Ukraine who's saying pro-Russian stuff, but he's got a deep Southern U.S. accent. I've seen a consistent program of Russian propaganda designed to reach nationalist dissident groups in the United States, and particularly Southern whites, in order to bring them over and have them look favorably upon Russia. And I don't think it's an accident that those same very demographic groups make up the lion's share of it.
Okay, let me pause it here. This is a horrendous bastardization of what I was trying to say. There is an element of Russian propaganda that functions, that works with dissonance, that works with contradiction, where Russia will assert one thing at one time and then the precise opposite the next time. Its aim is to flood the information space with confusing narratives so that it is extremely difficult to figure out the truth, and most people who are not especially dedicated will give up. And you see evidence of this in the proliferation of the narrative that Kiev was a feint. Despite all the evidence that I've mentioned, this persists, despite the fact that the only counter-argument that anyone has been able to adduce in favor of that narrative is just simple incredulity at the suggestion that Russia could be so incompetent, or that its intelligence sources could have so miscalculated, or perhaps that Ukrainian politicians had agreed to surrender the country, but the army had other plans. All you have is incredulity. So there are these narratives. There are also like various Russian propaganda videos that I could point to, like the one in Zaporizhia really comes out to me. This was when inspectors from the IAEA went to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and started looking around, and they noticed that Russian mortars or Russian artillery fire and so on, that it was laying around the plant in the rough vicinity of the plant or in the rough vicinity of that area, and that it seemed as though the ammunition had been fired from the side of Ukraine that Russia controls. And there was some Russian propagandist there holding up the mortar and trying to explain to these IAEA inspectors that no, in fact, when you fire this thing, it actually does a 360 in midair, and it lands in the ground in such a way as to make it look like it came from the opposite direction from which it really came. Actually, Ukraine. You see this also in the claims that Ukraine is bombing its own people, that it's bombing its own civilian infrastructure, that it is committing, that the Zelensky government is committing atrocities against its own people. There's no evidence for this whatsoever, none. And in the relatively small number of cases where we can examine the situation fairly clearly, everything points to the opposite. You know, the Russians say that Bucha was staged. The West says Bucha was an atrocity. The Russians say it was staged. Now, there are satellite photos taken from when the Russians still controlled Bucha, and you can see quite clearly corpses lying all over the streets in those photos. Now, what were those photos faked? Are they doctored? I mean, what's the issue here? I've heard that claim. I've heard that claim made by defenders of the Russian side. And so there is this tactic in Russian propaganda where if you bring up any point that contradicts the Russian narrative, they will always immediately jump to saying that whatever evidence you present is fake, is doctored, is not real. So if I point to the Oryx archive, oh, the Oryx archive is biased. Oh, some of those pictures are faked. Oh, some of those videos aren't real. Oh, the mortar did a 360 in the air and actually was fired from the Ukrainian side, but it only looks like it came from Russia. Another example that we can point to of Russian propagandists claiming something and then objective evidence showing it not to be true is the bombing of the administration. Gonzalo Lira was all over the place, verifiably saying, oh, the Ukrainians are bombing themselves, they're bombing themselves. Okay, if you look at that video closely, you can find it yourself. If you pause it, just before the missile hits the building, the missile is visible, and it's got a certain shape, and it looks like a Russian missile. What are they called? Calibers. They look like Caliber missiles. Only Russia or countries to whom Russia has sold those missiles have those missiles. And these are countries like Vietnam and Algeria. So unless this is a Vietnamese false flag, the Russians did this. Okay? But this is a persistent theme. Whatever is claimed. Whenever any bad or unflattering claim is made about the Russians, whenever they're accused of having committed an atrocity, whenever it is said that they lost a battle, they instantly flip everything over. No, our losses aren't losses, they're feints. No, the attacks on the Crimean airbase weren't attacks by the Ukrainian military. They were just Russian soldiers smoking where they shouldn't have been smoking. And so, our ammunition stocks blew up. Oh, no, the Ukrainians didn't shoot down and sink the Moskva. It was actually Russian soldiers, again, smoking where they shouldn't have been. This is done to pollute the information space and confuse people. And it is specifically when appealing to dissidents in the West, this is intended to take advantage of the pre-existing political intuitions that these dissidents have. And among those intuitions is the idea that the Western elite are hopelessly corrupt, that they lie about everything, and therefore that their claims should be treated with knee-jerk skepticism in a way that Russian claims should not be. Now, in saying that this is false, I of course do not deny that Western elite circles are packed to the brim with liars. Of course they are. You know, don't be ridiculous. Everyone knows this to be the case. Everyone understands it perfectly well, who's even slightly sentient. However, just because Western governments and the Western propaganda apparatus often lies does not mean that it is the only propaganda apparatus capable of lying. That is what I'm getting at. Now, as far as this description of Russian propaganda attempting to appeal to Southern rednecks, well, yes, there's some of that. And there are also attempts by the Russians to appeal to the far left in the US. It's not just the dissident right that the Russians try to appeal to, they appeal to the dissident left as well. And of course, you can't appeal to both the left and the right with the same narrative, so they propound contradictory narratives at different times. And so when you look at the entire apparatus of Russian propaganda as a whole, it's got no coherence to it. One narrative is propounded here, a totally contradictory one is propounded there, and the whole thing is a mess, shelter of confusion, and it is meant to be so. Now, you were about to reference some guy in Putin's inner circle. You're referring to Vladislav Surkov. You remembered this in the comments on the stream. It's written there. I saw it. And yes, he's mentioned in an Adam Curtis documentary. He's also mentioned in a wonderful book by Peter Pomerantsev called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And Surkov wrote this postmodern novel called Almost Zero, and this really tells you the kind of guy he is. He wrote this novel, and it's about a book collector, about a writer who writes a novel and then denies his own authorship. And then after writing this novel, and he's also an anti-Soviet dissident who writes a novel and then denies authorship, and the authorities begin persecuting him. Then, after writing and publishing this novel, Surkov published it under a different name, under a pseudonym. He then planted information that he was, in fact, the true author. The rumor began to spread that he was the true author, and when these rumors that he himself originally planted ended up reaching him, he denied being the author. It's this kind of weird, confusing, postmodern kind of game that he likes to play, and Surkov thinks this is funny. Now, this didn't start with Surkov. This goes back. This is a part of Russian propaganda and has been for quite a while. The Soviets did this. The Soviets would appeal to the left in the United States in, say, the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement and say, America is racist and all this. But at the same time, they would have no shame in oppressing their own ethnic minorities. So there's always these contradictory narratives. The one constant factor, the one thing that is always true, is the statement that Russia is strong. No matter what, Russia is strong. No matter what, Russia never takes any losses. This is why when they're thrown out of Kiev, it's a feint. This is why when they're thrown out of Kharkiv, when they're routed from Kharkiv, it's a strategic withdrawal. Even though, again, the Russians abandoned literally hundreds of military vehicles, and there are videos of Russian soldiers switching into civilian clothes and attempting to escape from Kharkiv on bicycles. There's no indication of a strategic withdrawal other than just baseless Russian attempts at face saving. That's the only consistent thread to Russian propaganda. Now, yes, if you only pay attention to a small sliver of that propaganda and ignore all the other elements that contradict it, it's not going to look to you like there are contradictory elements. But it doesn't follow that there are no such contradictory elements.
Infantry that fight for the United States military.
And this is the final thing I'll say on this point. This is why it is important that I speak the languages, and why, therefore, you should trust me. Because you don't speak the languages, you are at the mercy of anyone who attempts to construct narratives for you. Not everything about this war has been translated into English. A significant amount has not been. And because you are at the mercy of those who have made such translations, you really have no choice but to follow along to some extent with whatever narrative these people present. That's because you're hemmed in by a language barrier. I am not under this limitation. I have access to information that you do not. So this is why I think I should be taken seriously on this. And I have arguments, and I've given arguments throughout this stream and before, and will continue to give more arguments in the future. But yeah, just because you pay attention to a specific segment of Russian propaganda and ignore all the other segments that contradict it, does not mean that there isn't a dissonant and
I haven't seen Russian propaganda designed just to confuse and befuddle so that nobody thinks they can trust anything.
Because you haven't looked at all of it. Because you only look at it in a blinkered way. I mean, for example, I mean, just take the Kiev was a feint narrative. If you hear information that the Russians were defeated in Kiev, and then if you hear information that it was a feint, and you don't know which of these to believe, it's going to be very difficult for you to come to a conclusion. And the Russians know that, which is one of the reasons that they're propounding the Kiev was a feint narrative. On the other hand, for someone like you, for someone like Semiogogue, if the West says that the Russians were defeated in Kiev, the knee-jerk reaction is not to believe it. Even though there are explanations for some of the anomalies that went on during that portion of the fighting, and I have explanations for them. But the knee-jerk reaction is to disbelieve it, and then believe whatever the alternative happens to be, which is in this case the suggestion that Kiev was a feint.
I think that's based on the impressions formed of what that guy, I can't remember his name now, but he was supposed to be like a consigliere for Putin for a long.
Yes, Surkov. I just discussed this.
Time who was known. There's one of who's the guy who did the Century of the Self or whatever, the director who's done all those documentaries. They're half decent. There's one of them where that same guy talked about.
Just a quick comment on Adam Curtis's documentaries. They're well put together cinematically, certainly. Curtis is definitely an auteur, but man, oh man, are they incoherent. They just meander, and often you don't even know what his thesis is. Like you know, so as far as like sources of information, you should only watch a great deal about the subject at hand, because if you don't, they're very apt to confuse you and give you a misleading picture of things. And so on the whole, even though cinematically it's entertaining, I don't consider him a trustworthy source of information, unless you're talking about someone who's already knowledgeable. But if you're already knowledgeable on the subject, you don't need Curtis. So yeah, not a fan on the whole. Although I will say Pandora's Box, one of his early documentaries, that was good. That was good. The rest of them, meh.
About Russians, Putin's right-hand man, who is known for creating that uncertainty. Yeah, there is an aspect of that is going on. Absolutely. They attempt to create uncertainty so you can't be sure what's going on. Yes, Adam Curtis, thank you. But that's not the only thing that's going on with Russian propaganda. Russian propaganda.
Well, of course, it's not the only thing that's going on with Russian propaganda. If I allege that Russian propaganda is dissonant and contradictory, then by definition, it's not monolithic. I mean, that's just the point of logic.
It's enormous. Via Telegram, via Twitter, via all of this stuff. Western propaganda is at least as big. But to claim that Russian propaganda is just this one thing, and so if it doesn't look like this, it's not Russian propaganda. It just seems silly. Now, I will give in this. I've often wondered about whomever these figures are that back the Azov Battalion, because that's basically just like a gimme for Putin. Creating that group, whatever military size it actually is, I don't know, and nor at this point do I any longer care. But in favor of the idea that Ivan the Heathen puts forth, and that this Taras, whatever his name is, guy puts forth, that Zelensky is actually a puppet of the Russians. Well, I mean, I have wondered about things like the Azov Battalion, because that's just basically, that's like custom made for Russian propaganda purposes. The simple existence of that organization is custom made for Russian propaganda purposes. It's like one of the best things. It's a gimme for them.
Okay, at this point, he pretty much ends his comments. I mean, I don't remember anything significant being offered after this point. Let's just see.
And I don't doubt that there are large numbers of people who are in both. So in that respect, I think what Ivan the Heathen is saying and this other Taras.
Okay, so he's just saying, okay, it's possible. All right, I think that concludes my response to Semiogogue. That's all I wanted to say. Now I'm going to move on to Charlemagne and comment on his little on the Substack post he made. Okay, here it is. Important Ukraine war update. Okay, now before I begin this, let me just say thank you, Charlemagne. Thank you for sharing this. I am glad that it was of interest to you, and it certainly brought a lot of attention to the video, brought some people my way. I'm grateful for it, and yeah, thank you. Also, throughout this article, I mean, he's basically respectful and shows interest to this, so again, thank you. I appreciate it. But but I do have a few things that I want to quibble with, a few things that I want to add to what you've said. Okay, so I'm just going to begin reading this and commenting. I've just been shown some new information on the war in Ukraine that casts the entire conflict in a new light. I present here a summary of my key takeaways. This information comes from a video recorded on September 23rd. The host of the show, Ivan the Heathen, is an Ukrainian native who speaks Ukrainian, Russian, and English, obviously. Okay, that's all right. This is kind of nitpicky here. I was born in Ukraine, but I came to the United States in childhood. So I didn't live there long, and this is why I speak English without a Ukrainian accent. So I also speak, well, I speak Ukrainian without an American accent, but that's because I have a good ear and have, attempted to emulate the vocal intonations of those people properly. But anyway, the host of the show, Ivan the Heathen, is Ukrainian native, speaks Ukrainian, Russian, and English. Obviously, you should watch the entire video yourself. Yes, you should. But here is the basic summary. On February 24th, 2022, the Ukrainian government was filled with fifth colonists who intended to surrender the country to Russia. This goes all the way up to President Zelensky himself, in fact, a Western Russian one. President Zelensky had issued orders to the Ukrainian military designed to allow the Russian army simply to march into the country and take it over without a fight. However, Ukrainian generals loyal to Ukraine and not its president disobeyed orders and arranged for a real defense of Ukraine. What proceeded to happen is that the Russian military marched into the country as planned, but began to face opposition that it not only did not expect, but was entirely unprepared for. The military force that Mr. Putin sent into Russia was nothing more than a military parade that would accept the surrender of Ukraine and cede control over the country in whole or in part to Russia. Mr. Putin made the grave mistake of believing that President Zelensky was Ukraine when in fact he was not. That's a line directly taken from Chernobyl, by the way. So I know that you watched closely, Charlemagne. Russia therefore found itself in a war that was not supposed to happen. Yes, that is basically an accurate summary. I find the gentleman's take very compelling because the narrative he presents explains many mysterious things about the war that I've yet to make sense of. I am very glad that you noticed this. That is precisely it. That is precisely the reaction that I was intending to elicit. I'm glad that that happened. Please note, I also find his own reasoning for why you should trust him compelling, but I would be more skeptical if his story did not possess the explanatory power that it does. Yes, as I said, to repeat again, I know the languages, most of you don't, and therefore you are prisoners of selective translations and the selective narratives that accompany them. I am not. So I have access to things that you don't. And I'm also just kind of generally acculturated. Like I know things about the Russian culture of corruption in its military and all over its politics that would not lead me to draw the kinds of conclusions about the combat effectiveness of the Russian military that Semiogogue draws, for example. Okay, so here's some of what the video explains roughly in chronological order. 1, the immense Russian death toll at the beginning of the war. When this war began, we were told Western media 1,000 Russian soldiers being killed on a daily basis. We didn't believe it. Maybe the case that these figures are basically accurate. Maybe it was only hundreds per day. Regardless of the Russian military forces present on Ukrainian soil, these forces were not arranged in battle formation, but as a military parade, and it was a military parade that was ambushed, a parade that was told it would not face resistance. Yes, that is correct. That is correct. I already discussed this stuff about the Russian death toll. As I said, just more generally, I'll say this about the Ukrainian General Staff's claims about how many Russian soldiers have been killed in the war, because now Ukraine claims about 60,000, just over 60,000. When I last checked, let me make sure here, claimed Russian losses, yeah, 60,430 as of today. Now, the ratio in the RX archive between Russian vehicular losses and Ukrainian vehicular losses is about 4-to-1. Now, as I said, part of my argument for why you should trust the Ukrainian claims more or less, why they are not precisely accurate, I don't say that, but at least somewhere in the general vicinity of the truth, is that vehicular losses are probably significantly correlated to personnel losses. I think this is reasonable. So if you've got a 4-to-1 ratio of Russian losses to Ukrainian losses, it is reasonable to surmise that the losses of troops may also be roughly 4-to-1. Not exactly 4-to-1. I don't allege that it's exactly so, but somewhere in the general vicinity of that. It might be 3 to 1, it might be 3.5 to 1, it might be 2.5 to 1, but not something that's wildly off the mark from that. And we can subject the various claims of the Ukrainian and the Russian general staffs to this data and see what we get. So basically, if there's a 4 to 1 ratio of Russian vehicular losses to Ukrainian vehicular losses, there's probably something like a 4 to 1 personnel loss ratio as well. Now, the Ukrainians release information about their personnel losses only rarely and sporadically, unfortunately. The last statement I was able to hear was that about 13,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed in the war. This is what the general staff claims. Now, this was over a month ago, so it is safe to assume that this figure is higher now. Let's say it's like 15 or 16,000. Well, you multiply that by 4, that works. Let's say it's 20,000. Well, multiply it by 3, you get about 60,000. Multiply by 4, you get about 80,000. So somewhere between 60 and 80. This is not far off the mark. Now compare this, on the other hand, to the claims made by the Russian general staff. And let me pull them up exactly, see if I can find them. Let's see. Ukrainian, Russian war losses. Casualties of the Russo-Ukrainian war. There you go. Hold on. Then we got internet issues here. Deaths by regions. No. Foreign fight volunteers. Okay. Total casualties. There you go. Okay. Casualties. Russian forces. Time period. Okay. Oh, this is what the Russian forces claim. They claim to have lost 5,937 men. That's what they've lost. And then they claim, wait, is it here? Is it even here? Hold on. Oh, the Russians claim that the Ukrainians have lost 61,207 and that 49,363 were wounded. Now let's subject that to the data. If this were true, okay, let's say it's true that about 6,000 Russians were killed. Now, at a 4 to 1 ratio of Russian vehicle losses to Ukrainian losses, that would lead to the conclusion that roughly 1,500 Ukrainian soldiers had died. No one believes that. I mean, come on, I want Ukraine to win this war, of course, but I'm not stupid enough to believe that. So that's one big problem for that claim. Now, let's take the Russian claim that they've killed 61,007 Ukrainians. Well, again, apply the 4 to 1 ratio, you get something like 240 to 250,000 Russians killed. Again, I want the Russians to lose, but I'm not stupid enough to believe that they've lost that many. So this just doesn't fit with the Oryx data. This contradicts it wildly by an enormous amount. So if the Oryx data indicates a roughly 4 to 1 ratio in favor of Ukraine, and Russian claims about losses are 10 to 1, then in order for the Russian claims to be true, then the Oryx data would have to be biased systematically, not just randomly, but systematically biased by a factor of about 40. How likely is that? Whereas roughly more or less the Ukrainian claims do fit with the Oryx data. And so the general picture that emerges is one of Ukraine basically at least sort of staying within the vicinity of what's probable or likely to be the case, whereas the Russians are just completely pulling things out of their asses. I'm not saying that the Ukrainian claims are exactly correct, but they're roughly accurate. I think they're probably more or less what the Ukrainians claim that they are. All right, let's go on here. But yeah, he's right that what I said was that these Russian forces went into Ukraine thinking that they were going on parade, and the Ukrainians ambushed them and obliterated them, which explains why you see things like this, why you see destroyed Russian tech stretching across, entire streets over and over. Okay, number 2, bizarre Russian paratroop operations. Russian paratroopers and special forces were dropped in key locations at the beginning of the war, only to be utterly blown out. WTF, just doesn't make sense why they would be deployed in positions where they would be hopelessly outgunned. It does make sense if the purpose was to keep up the pretense of an invasion while the reality was supposed to be that surrender had already taken place. Yes. Amen. I agree with that. That is correct. That is a correct. That's correct in general, if you ask me, and it's also a correct description of what I'm alleging. The Kiev offensive. What's up with the aborted offensive of Kiev and Kharkiv? Kharkiv with an I, not an O. Don't use the Russian spelling. Bad, bad. No, don't do that. That's a no-no. The Russians made a blitz toward the city and then stopped at the outskirts, seemingly devoid of numbers of men and equipment necessary to siege a city of that size. It was obvious that Russia did not have the tools available to take the city. Surely the Russian military planners were not that dumb. Well, the answer is that it was never supposed to be an offensive. The Ukrainian army was put out of position by Zelensky so that the Russians could quickly march in and appear to cut the head off the snake. His own generals disobeyed him and countered the Russian attempt. Yes. Why did Russia take over so much land in the first 2 months and then stall? None of the offensives that took place in the early parts of the war were offensives at all. They were not real military operations. The Russians basically walked into deliberately undefended territory until reaching the actual defenses the patriotic Ukrainian generals were able to throw together, despite President Zelensky's deliberate undermining of the military. Russia's most elite units were caught off guard, like the First Guards Tank Army, like the VDV, which I went into specifics about, and wiped off the board by that defense, which slowed their operations even more. 5. Why is Zelensky constantly running around the world on apparent diplomatic missions? Shouldn't be in Ukraine directing the war. It's simple. The less time Zelensky spends in Ukraine, the fewer opportunities there are to detain him in a military coup. Additionally, by securing relationships with NATO to support the war, he's making himself more essential to the Ukrainian military effort. If President Zelensky were actually directing the war effort, Ukraine would have surrendered in February and March. Now, I didn't play Semiogogue's criticism of you on this point, but I agree with him. The suggestion that Zelensky should, for some reason, be planning the war effort is absurd. Zelensky used to be a comedian. Remember that? There's no indication that he would be competent to plan such a thing. Although the point about running around on diplomatic missions and trying to secure relationships with NATO as a way of making himself more important, there's probably some validity to that. But in general, there's no reason to suspect that Zelensky would even be competent to carry out military operations. Even if he were not a traitor, the rational thing for him to do would be to just say, I don't understand military strategy. I'm going to let the Russians take care of this. So there's really nothing to explain here. This isn't really such an anomaly. What's up with the Kharkiv counteroffensive? How did the Ukrainians actually pull this off, and why did it take so long? The Ukrainian military hid the operation from their government. According to Yuri Shvets, yes, that is what happened. President Zelensky and his faction are currently prosecuting Ukrainian heroes who stood up and defended the country. Yes, I mentioned Tatiana Chornovol, General Krivonyis, Serhiy Krivonyis, and who was the Marchenko, of course, Dmytro Marchenko. These generals, Marchenko being the general who set up the defense of Mykolaiv, Krivonyis being the one who defended the airport in Zhuliano, they have had criminal investigations opened up against them. Despite what they did, despite their quick thinking, despite repelling the Russian attack. That is very bizarre. If there wasn't treason, I really strain to see how that could be explained. But anyway, he is actively undermining the war effort, that is Zelensky, and therefore the operation had to be kept secret even from the Ukrainian government. In reality, Ukraine has two governments, the civilian traitor government of President Zelensky and a separate semi-self-governing military. Zelensky is now actively playing both sides, keeping his options open with Mr. Putin and with the West. I think it is safe to say, though, that by now, this may have been true when Charlemagne wrote it, but by now, it's safe to say that he's no longer playing both sides. If Zelensky submitted an application to join NATO, then he sees the writing on the wall. He sees that Ukraine is going to win this war, that Russia is going to lose, that the West has scored a win here, and so he's going to pick the winning side. So, yeah, that's the one amendment I would make to that. Why has Russia's response been so schizo? E.g., we are still selling gas to Europe. Actually, no, we're cutting off the gas. Russia was caught completely with its pants down when it found itself in an actual war. In effect, the trepset for Russia was even worse than any of us in the West thought. Many of us believed that Mr. Putin was drawn into a war by the West, that he had at least planned for, but it appears that this was not the case, and therefore Russia's political response has been awkward, to say the least. Yes, but there is also another consideration, which is that the Russians like to keep people on their toes, and they are extremely vindictive with their enemies. So this is just in line with their general behavior. They want, frankly, they want to fuck with Europe. That also is a factor. Okay, 8. What's up with the nuclear threats from Europe? Same thing. They want to fuck with Europe. They want to scare them. And the most important thing for Russia is that it be regarded as a military power, and therefore that it be feared. If it cannot achieve this through conventional means, it will achieve it through nuclear means. But anyway, to read on. I know a lot of people will, well, actually this, but let's be real. Whatever language it's couched in, Russia is making nuclear threats to the West. This is not meant as a moral judgment. It is just a fact. And the answer as to why is that Russia has basically lost its army in the initial field operations and is now working with a debilitated force that has lost most of its best men and equipment. Yes, this seems likely to be true. The indications are that the last remnants of Russian elite troops are currently in the Kherson region, and they have been cut off. They have been prevented from retreating, or at least prevented from retreating with their equipment, because the Ukrainian military has damaged all of the bridges that run across the Dnipro River, which means that those units could retreat, but they would have to drop their equipment and retreat on foot if they were to do so. However, in addition to that, Putin has ordered these units not to retreat. And so if they retreat, they'll be shot, they'll be thrown in jail, something awful will happen to them. And so they're basically stuck in Kherson fighting to the death. But because these are Russian elite units, they are pound for pound better than the Ukrainian forces that are there, and therefore they are inflicting heavy casualties upon Ukraine. Ukrainian sources themselves admit this. So this is not something that Ukraine denies. It acknowledges taking heavy casualties in this area, but the writing is already on the wall. These guys are trapped. They can't be resupplied. It's only a matter of time. And in fact, only yesterday, Ukraine made a massive push in the Kherson region and took, a push that went for approximately 30 kilometers, which would make it the longest single push of this war, which means that those elite forces that remain in the Kherson region have, at this point, been significantly degraded, and Russia just doesn't have any good fighters left anymore. So yes, basically, I suppose working with a debilitated force has lost the best men and equipment. This is a dire situation, so of course Russia will in desperation make these threats. Yes. 9, why does Putin never mention Zelensky? If you pay attention to his official statements, you will notice that Putin rarely, if ever, mentions President Zelensky and makes much more frequent reference to the West. You would think that he would mention the leader of the country that his country is at war with more often. The answer is that President Zelensky is Russia's greatest ally. He is still trying to undermine the Ukrainian war effort in this weird triple-cross game. Zelensky went from, the word from is missing, being a stooge for Russia to went from being a stooge to Russia to being a stooge for NATO, while still ultimately trying to give Mr. Putin the victory. Again, I would amend this. Putin doesn't mention Zelensky because he has utter contempt for Zelensky. And he has utter contempt for Zelensky, not because of who Zelensky is, but because he would have utter contempt for any Ukrainian president. Because as I showed, Russians do not acknowledge the existence of Ukraine as an independent country. You're not a real president. You're not a real head of state. The only people that the Russians respect are those whom they regard as militarily powerful, like NATO, like the United States. That is why Putin talks about the West. Okay, point 10. Thomas 777 has wondered why Mr. Putin has been such a bad military leader. Why didn't he just storm across Ukraine with armored divisions? Why such a half-assed approach? The answer is basically the same as 4. Mr. Putin did not plan for a real war. He planned for a phony war that was effectively just a disguised political coup. Yes, but also in addition to that, he really is just a bad military strategist. Why would you order your elite units not to retreat from Kherson? That area is lost. You are sentencing those units to death, and they are among the last remnants of elite units that you have. Surely you will need them somewhere else. But Putin doesn't want to do that, because ordering those units to retreat would mean surrendering Kherson, which would be a massive loss of face for him. He's too proud to do this. And so those elite soldiers have to die to, safeguard his pride. It's absurd. This is not smart from the standpoint of military strategy. Academic Agent asks, why doesn't Putin just declare war? The answer is again the same. There was never supposed to be a war. Yes, and there is also an additional factor. And this concerns the nature of the Russian population. The Russian population is extremely politically passive. It doesn't care about politics. I mentioned this in the first video. It's virtually impossible to have a serious political conversation with Russians. They are completely demobilized politically, and Putin likes this. He likes this because he doesn't want people making noise. He wants them to sit quietly while he makes all the decisions and makes all the rules and essentially controls everything. So So he has a politically demobilized population. So he's sort of reached an agreement with the population, therefore. You will be politically demobilized, you will not make noise, and in exchange, I will not draft you for war. And ordering a mobilization, even a partial one, declaring war formally, would be a violation of this agreement. Now, circumstances have forced Putin to do so, and we've seen the results. We've seen that more men have now fled Russia than have been mobilized for the war. So that's the other point that's not addressed here. Okay, moving on. Obviously, there is a war now. Mr. Putin is mobilizing the country for war. Regardless as to whether or not NATO started the war, it's running now. Even given Russia's blunders, Ukraine would be totally outmatched without NATO support. Yeah, that's almost certainly true. If the Russian elite units hadn't been blown the hell out in the first days, yeah, Ukraine would be in trouble. There's no question about it. With its hollowed out military, with its debilitated weapon systems, all done purposely by Zelensky, yes. With NATO support, the war would be grueling for Russia and could possibly bring down the entire Russian Federation, which would be absolutely terrible. I disagree. It would be beautiful and glorious, and I await the day with excitement. Mr. Putin is not lying when he says that Russia is at war with the West, and the more desperate the situation, the more likely it is that the war escalates all the way up to nuclear conflict. This war would be especially bad if the Russian Federation collapsed and the Russian nuclear arsenal ended up in the hands of various Slavic warlords contending for power. That depends on where the borders of the various new states that the collapsing Russian Federation breaks up into are drawn. It may very well be that you can arrive at a situation where there will be nukes located in one territory, but the launch codes will be present in another. And so you'll have just a total mess. That's possible. In fact, likely, given what the ethnic divisions in Russia are actually like. Moving on, make no mistake, if the information presented by the gentleman in the video is accurate, the global situation is dire. It would be one thing if Russia was in as strong a position as it appears to be from the West. I would argue that it doesn't appear to be so in the West. It only appears to be so to Western dissidents because they are receiving a slanted diet of information. And quite another if Russia is finding itself increasingly in an increasingly desperate situation that was entirely unplanned for. Okay, that being said, Mr. Putin is building a significant number of partnerships in Asia. I don't know what you're referring to here, Charlemagne. China is largely giving Putin the cold shoulder. It is buying his oil. Yes, it is buying his gas, but the oil is being bought at a $35 discount, which given the price of Russian Urals oil right now, I don't even know if the Russians are making money on it. Same goes with India. And India is going to run out of storage capacity for oil pretty soon, and they're not going to be buying any more. Also, I mean, what other country could you be referring to? Could you be referring to Uzbekistan? Certainly not. When Putin traveled there recently, the president of Uzbekistan showed up late to a meeting with him. The president of Uzbekistan does not show up late to a meeting with Vladimir Putin. This is blatantly a sign of disrespect. Maybe Joe Biden could get away with that. Maybe Xi Jinping. Maybe even someone like Erdogan could get away with that, but not the president of Uzbekistan. Furthermore, in the earlier days of the war, the Uzbek government actually allowed pro-Ukrainian protesters to protest in the capital. That's a big statement. You can't really be referring to Kazakhstan either, because they're making moves to try to move out of the Russian sphere of influence. The Kazakhs are changing their alphabet to a Latin alphabet from a Cyrillic one, which is a big deal for them. And also, the Kazakh government has offered to sell Europe its oil. So Russia is clearly losing influence here. I don't know what you're referring to when you're saying that it's building up significant partnerships in Asia. Rather, I think the trend is that Russia is well on the path to global and geostrategic irrelevance. How stable these relationships are remain to be seen. There's been some rumor of the possibility of a military coup against Putin. Maybe. I wouldn't bet on it. And there's certainly something going on with China with President Xi. Turns out it's nothing. He was just working from home and quarantining, in accordance with the COVID restrictions that had been imposed there. That's all. There was no military coup. Xi was not under house arrest. Nothing happened there. Whatever the case may be, we should continue to desire a quick negotiated settlement to this war before things get more out of hand than they are. NATO and the American government especially, is acting particularly retarded in this situation. I believe Mr. Putin's nuclear threats, and I also believe that the American government does not believe him, and worse than that, actively seeks the complete demise of the Russian Federation. Okay, the American government is probably correct not to believe his threats. Remember all that stuff about corruption and in the Russian military and parts being taken out of weapon systems? That applies to the Russian nuclear arsenal as well. I would estimate conservatively, given what I know about the scale and extent of Russian corruption in the military, probably 2/3 of the Russian nuclear arsenal wouldn't even fire. I don't think 2/3 of those missiles would even fire if you push the button. And half of those probably don't even have sufficient fuel to reach the United States. So NATO and the American government have probably calculated that in the event of a nuclear strike, which would undoubtedly be awful, I'm not minimizing this for a moment, but they've calculated that Russia would get the worst of it by far in the case of a nuclear exchange, and that is probably going to deter Putin. I think that this is probably correct. Not absolutely so. One never knows with absolute certainty, but I think they're probably right here. Okay, probably the single most insane policy the American government is prosecuting at the moment, and that's saying quite a lot given the state of the world in 2022. I don't see why. I think the Russian Federation is long overdue for collapse. Destroying and dismantling centuries of Russian imperialism. Wonderful, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Give the ethnic minorities their nation and allow the Ukrainians to be themselves a nation. Also, just take away all this power and all these resources from this, imperialistic terrorist state. It's a wonderful thing. Now, that's not to say that the American government in its own way is not also an imperialistic terrorist state. I don't say that for a moment. Of course it is also. However, there are structural and demographic problems within the United States, and we all know about these. I do not need to rehash them here. And the fact of the matter is the American elite has no interest in doing anything, has shown no interest in doing anything to resolve any of these problems. And so those things will lead to the eventual collapse of the United States. Not today, not tomorrow, but in a few decades, yes. The United States cannot remain in a position of global geostrategic dominance if its population has a third world level average IQ. That simply can't happen. So the long-term trends are against the United States anyway. All right, next. Ukraine is way outside of anything that could be said to be within the legitimate American sphere of influence, and America and NATO should be staying out of this conflict. I agree that it's outside the American sphere of influence, but it's also outside the Russian sphere of influence. Ukraine is an independent country, and so for that matter are Chechnya and Dagestan and all of these. This notion of a sphere of influence is just it's just odious. Nothing like this should exist. Of course, I am not saying that just because it is good that the Russian Federation will likely be destroyed, or at least significantly reduced in influence, that it would not also be good if this also happens to the United States. But obviously, if you have two thieves or two criminals, criminal A and criminal B, and only criminal B is caught and criminal A is not, it does not follow that you should allow criminal B to run free until you are also able to catch criminal A. That's clear, right? So I ultimately oppose all of these things. As I see it, there are three major, major kind of imperialistic Leviathan states today, and they are the United States, China, and Russia. And all three of them, for various reasons, are headed for collapse. With the outbreak of this war, I am more optimistic than I have ever been in quite a while that I will live to see the collapse of all three of these. And I think that is a cause for celebration. That's a wonderful thing. I'm not going to get into the reasons why, but I would love to see all three of these things dismantled. And I believe they will be. Yeah, so that's it. God have mercy on us in the times ahead. Sure, I can agree with that. And that's pretty much all I have to say there. That was a very long stream, but that pretty much concludes my thoughts. I have ignored the chat utterly in this stream, so I'm going to glance at it briefly, and if there's anything interesting, I might respond to it. But to be honest, I've been sitting here so long that I'm kind of getting tired. So let's just do that back. Okay. All right. Yeah, there seems to be quite a bit here. Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to let the chat go. Honestly, I've said everything I want to say. But yeah, that's that. That's my response to Semiogogue and to Charlemagne. Thank you for sharing the video. I'm glad it was of interest to you, and that's it. That's all I got to say.